I never told my son-in-law I was the CEO of the multi-billion-dollar company he worked for. To him, I was just Julian Carter, an old broke black man living on a fixed pension in a rundown house. When he invited me to a fancy dinner with his wealthy white parents, I wanted to see how they would treat a man they thought had nothing. Halfway through the meal, his mother looked at me with pure disgust, slid a white envelope across the table, and told me I was an embarrassment. 2 minutes later, sitting in my old truck, I made a single phone call that would systematically dismantle their perfect, arrogant lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. The clinking of expensive crystal and the low murmur of Atlanta elite filled the dining room of the restaurant. I sat at a corner table wearing my oldest, most comfortable corduroy jacket. The fabric was frayed at the elbows, and it was a stark contrast to the tailored silk suits and designer dresses surrounding us. Across from me sat my son-in-law, Preston Cole, and his parents, Richard and Camilla. Preston was nervously adjusting his luxury watch, a timepiece I knew cost more than what he thought I made in 5 years. He would not meet my eyes. Richard sat stiffly in his navy blue suit. His posture screamed of generational arrogance. Camilla, dripping in pearls that looked heavy enough to choke her, stared at my jacket as if it were a disease. She had barely touched her expensive plate of food. For the past hour, the conversation had been a thinly veiled interrogation of my poverty. They talked about their recent trip to Europe, their exclusive country club memberships, and the expensive renovations on their summer home. They made sure to speak loudly enough so I would understand the massive gap between our worlds. I just nodded and ate my meal in silence. I was playing the part of the simple, uneducated old man they expected me to be. Camilla cleared her throat. It was a sharp sound that cut through the background music. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crisp white envelope. She placed it on the white linen tablecloth and slowly, deliberately slid it across to me. Preston finally looked up. His face flushed red, but he stayed quiet. Richard crossed his arms and looked at me with a mix of pity and disdain. I looked at the envelope and then at Camilla. I asked her what it was, keeping my voice low and respectful. Camilla offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Julian, we are realistic people." She began, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "We know you struggle. We know Maya works hard to support your modest lifestyle. But next week is the annual corporate gala for Apex Logistics." Preston leaned forward. He was unable to contain his ambition. "Julian, I am up for the regional CEO position. It is the biggest night of my career. The phantom chairman of the parent company Carter Holdings is flying in. Nobody has seen this guy in 10 years. The entire executive board will be there. If I get this promotion, Maya and I are set for life." Richard took over, his voice hard and uncompromising. "And we cannot afford any distractions or embarrassments." Camilla tapped the envelope with her manicured fingernail. "There is $10,000 in cash in there, Julian. We want you to take a vacation. Go to Florida. Go anywhere. Just do not show up at that gala. Your presence, your wardrobe, your demeanor. It does not fit the image Preston needs to project to the chairman. You would drag him down." I stared at the envelope. $10,000. To them, it was a bribe to hide the dirty family secret. The poor black father-in-law. They thought I was a heavy burden on my daughter Maya. Maya, my brilliant, beautiful girl who was currently working a double shift at the hospital because she believed she needed to help pay off Preston's student loans. I raised Maya as a single father after my wife Vivian passed away 10 years ago. I raised her to be fiercely independent and to value hard work over handouts. That is exactly why I never told her the truth about my bank accounts. She grew up in a comfortable but modest home thinking I was just a middle manager at a warehouse. She had no idea that 40 years ago I started sweating in a Detroit warehouse loading boxes 12 hours a day. She had no idea that I saved every penny, bought that warehouse, then bought the trucking company, and then bought the entire supply chain. I built Carter Holdings with my own 2 hands, blood and tears, and Carter Holdings owned Apex Logistics. Preston Cole was sitting across from me, paying me to hide from myself. He was terrified that his poor father-in-law would embarrass him in front of the phantom chairman. He had no idea he was looking right at him. I could have thrown the money in their faces. I could have announced who I was right then and there to watch them choke on their arrogance. But anger is a poor substitute for strategy. I learned a long time ago in the business world that when your enemy is digging a hole, you do not take away their shovel. You hand them a bigger one. I picked up the envelope. It felt thick and heavy with their condescension. I looked at Camilla, whose patronizing smile widened. She thought she had won. I looked at Richard, who smirked, satisfied that everyone has a price. And I looked at Preston, the man who was supposed to love and protect my daughter, sitting there allowing his parents to treat her father like garbage. "I understand," I said quietly. My voice was completely flat. I slipped the envelope into the inside pocket of my frayed corduroy jacket. I pushed my chair back and stood up. Preston let out a deep breath he had been holding. "Thanks, Julian," he muttered, looking down at the tablecloth again. "Enjoy the vacation." I did not say another word. I turned my back on them and walked out of the restaurant. The cool Atlanta night air hit my face as I stepped outside. The valet took one look at my jacket and immediately pointed me toward the self-parking lot down the street. I did not mind. I walked 2 blocks to where I had parked my 10-year-old Ford pickup truck. I climbed inside, and the worn vinyl seats creaked under my weight. I sat there in the dark for a moment. The silence of the truck was a stark contrast to the pretentious chatter of the restaurant. I pulled the envelope out of my pocket. $10,000. A bribe from a middle manager trying to play in the big leagues. I tossed it onto the passenger seat. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It was an older model, nothing flashy. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," the voice said. It was Marcus Vance, the man the corporate world believed was the CEO of Carter Holdings. In reality, Marcus was my proxy. He was my right-hand man who executed my orders while I remained the invisible majority shareholder. "Marcus," I said, my voice no longer that of a frail old man, but the voice that had built a global empire. "I need you to initiate a shadow audit on the Atlanta branch of Apex Logistics immediately." Marcus did not hesitate. "Of course, sir. Is there a specific target?" "Yes," I replied, staring out the windshield at the city lights. "Preston Cole. He is the regional director. I want to see every expense report, every budget cut, every vendor contract, and every corporate credit card statement he has signed for the last 3 years. Comb through it with a fine-tooth comb. I want to know where every single penny is going." "Understood, Mr. Carter," Marcus replied efficiently. "May I ask what prompted this?" I watched a luxury sports car drive past my truck. "He is hiding something, Marcus. A man who throws away $10,000 in cash to hide his father-in-law is a man who is living far beyond his legitimate salary. He is desperate to impress the chairman at the gala next week. Let us find out exactly how he is funding his ambition. I will have the preliminary files sent to your secure server by morning, sir." "Thank you, Marcus. And make sure nobody at Apex knows they are being audited. I want to catch him completely off guard." I hung up the phone and started the engine. The old Ford rumbled to life. As I drove through the streets of Atlanta heading back to my modest house, I felt a cold, calculated calm wash over me. Preston Cole thought he could buy my dignity. He thought he could erase me from his life to climb the corporate ladder. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He forgot that the ladder he was climbing belonged to me, and I was about to break the rungs right out from under him. The sun had barely crested the Atlanta skyline when my secure laptop chimed on the kitchen counter. I was already awake, drinking my black coffee and watching the steam rise in the quiet of my modest home. It was an encrypted email from Marcus, my proxy CEO. The subject line was empty. I set my mug down and opened the file. What I saw on that screen was not just corporate mismanagement. It was a massacre of the very foundation I had built. Red flags did not just pop up, they bled across every spreadsheet and financial ledger from the Atlanta branch of Apex Logistics. Preston Cole had been a busy man. I scrolled through pages of authorized expenditures, noticing a pattern of unjustified budget cuts that targeted the warehouse floor. He had slashed the safety budget by 40%. He had frozen all overtime pay for the drivers and the loaders. But the most glaring issue was the discretionary funds. Millions of dollars were being siphoned off and routed into a web of obscure vendor contracts. Consulting fees for companies that did not exist. Logistics optimization payments made to offshore LLCs that traced back to empty shell corporations. Preston was bleeding my company dry. He was starving the hardworking men and women on the floor to artificially inflate the branch profit margins. He was doing all of this to secure his promotion to regional CEO at the upcoming gala, while secretly lining his own pockets to fund his luxury lifestyle and pay off his mounting debts. A cold fury settled in my chest. I had built Carter Holdings by loading trucks in the freezing Detroit winters. I knew what it meant to break your back for a paycheck, And here was this arrogant boy in a tailored suit stealing from my people to buy sports cars and $10,000 bribes. Digital proof was a good start, but any slick corporate lawyer could argue that it was an accounting error or shift the blame to a subordinate. I needed the localized hard drive data. I needed the unencrypted internal memos stored directly on his personal machine. I needed physical proof that Preston Cole was the architect of this fraud. I walked into my bedroom and opened the back of my closet. I did not reach for a custom-tailored Italian suit. Instead, I pulled out a simple gray janitor uniform. I own the commercial cleaning company that services the Apex Logistics building. It is a small subsidiary of Carter Holdings, but it granted me absolute access. I printed a valid maintenance badge with my photo and a fake name. There is a profound truth I learned long ago. People who think they are important never look at the people they consider beneath them. To the executives in their glass towers, a man pushing a mop is entirely invisible. They look right past you. It was the perfect disguise. I drove my beat-up Ford truck downtown and parked in the underground service level of the Apex Logistics glass high-rise. The security guards at the loading dock barely glanced at me as I swiped my badge. The green light beeped and the heavy metal doors slid open. I walked right into the belly of my own empire, completely undetected. I grabbed a cleaning cart from the supply closet and wheeled it into the service elevator, pushing the button for the executive floor. The doors opened to a sprawling expanse of polished marble modern art and floor-to-ceiling glass walls. The contrast between this lavish executive suite and the grimy warehouse floors below made my stomach turn. As I pushed my cart down the long corridor toward the corner office, I heard a commotion coming from the open layout near the warehouse overlook. I steered my cart closer, keeping my head down, and began wiping a glass partition. Standing there was Preston Cole. He was wearing a sharp-tailored suit, looking smug and untouchable. Standing opposite him were two older black men wearing heavy work boots and high-visibility vests. I recognized the exhaustion in their shoulders. They were veteran warehouse managers, the kind of men who kept the gears turning when the executives were out playing golf. Preston was leaning against a desk with his arms crossed. He had an arrogant smirk on his face while his two junior executives flanked him, chuckling like hyenas. I focused on wiping the glass, but I listened to every word. Preston spoke in a loud, dismissive tone, telling the two men that their departments were being consolidated. He told them their positions were eliminated effective immediately. One of the older men stepped forward, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. He told Preston that he had given 20 years to this company. He said his pension was set to vest in 3 months, and if he was fired now, he would lose a massive portion of his retirement. He mentioned his wife's medical bills and begged Preston to let him stay on the floor, even as a regular loader, just until the pension cleared. Preston did not even blink. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and laughed. He looked the man dead in the eye and said it was just business. He told them they were dead weight and that Apex Logistics was trimming the fat to optimize for the future. He signaled for the security guards to escort the two men out of the building without even giving them a chance to clear out their lockers properly. I watched the two veteran managers walk away with their heads bowed, stripped of their dignity after decades of loyalty. Preston turned to his executives and joked about how much money they just saved the branch on the quarterly report. He bragged that his bonus at the gala was going to be massive. My grip on the mop handle tightened until my knuckles ached. The urge to drop the disguise to step forward and fire Preston on the spot was overwhelming. I wanted to see the color drain from his face. I wanted to strip him of his power right there in front of the men he had just destroyed. But I forced myself to breathe. A quick firing was too good for him. He needed to be systematically dismantled. The trap was not fully set. I watched Preston check his luxury watch and tell his cronies he was taking them out for an early celebratory lunch. They walked toward the elevators, laughing and patting each other on the back. The moment the elevator doors closed, I moved my cleaning cart directly to Preston's corner office. The door was locked, but a master maintenance key card easily granted me access. I slipped inside and closed the solid oak door behind me, locking it from the inside. The office was an insult to the working class. It featured a plush leather sofa, imported liquor on a silver tray, and expensive abstract art bought with stolen money. I walked straight to his heavy mahogany desk and sat in his high-backed leather chair. His computer monitor was asleep. I nudged the mouse and the password screen appeared. I reached into my gray uniform pocket and pulled out a specialized encrypted flash drive provided by my cybersecurity team. I plugged it directly into the back of his machine. I did not need his password. Because I owned the entire network infrastructure, my drive contained a master admin override that bypassed his local security protocols in seconds. The screen blinked black, and then a progress bar appeared as the drive began cloning his local files, his unencrypted internal memos, and his hidden offshore routing numbers. The progress bar began to crawl. 10%, 20%. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the computer processor. I watched the file names flash rapidly across the screen. I saw folders named after the fake consulting firms. I saw expense reports masking luxury car payments as logistics maintenance. I saw the digital footprints of a man who believed he was untouchable. 50%, 60%. I kept my eyes on the door. The frosted glass panels allowed me to see blurry shadows moving in the hallway outside, but no one paid attention to the closed office of the regional director. 75%. The downloading process felt agonizingly slow. Every second that ticked by was a massive risk. If anyone walked in and saw a janitor sitting at the regional director's desk downloading files, the entire operation would be blown. Preston would have time to destroy the evidence and hide his tracks. 85%, 90%. Suddenly I heard the unmistakable sound of loud, arrogant laughter echoing down the hallway. It was getting closer. It was Preston. He must have forgotten something or decided to skip his lunch. 95%. I watched the shadow of his figure loom outside the frosted glass door. I heard him telling his junior executive to go ahead to the restaurant and that he would be right down. 98%. I could not pull the flash drive out yet. Ripping it out before the cloning protocol finished would corrupt the data and trigger a localized security alarm on his machine. I sat frozen in his leather chair staring at the loading bar. 99%. A keycard beeped against the electronic lock on the outside of the door. The heavy mechanical latch disengaged with a sharp click. 100%. Transfer complete. I yanked the flash drive from the port and shoved it deep into my pocket just as the heavy oak door swung open. Preston Cole walked into the office. He stopped dead in his tracks. His arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer aggressive confusion as he locked eyes with the old black man in a janitor uniform standing behind his desk. The heavy oak door of the corner office swung open with a sharp click. I was standing directly behind the custom mahogany desk. The encrypted flash drive was already disconnected from the computer and hidden in the palm of my hand, but I had no time to step away. Preston Cole walked in. He froze in his tracks. The smug smile he had been wearing just moments ago completely vanished. He stared at my gray janitor uniform, and then his eyes traveled up to my face. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He recognized the man from the restaurant. He recognized his father-in-law. The blood rushed to his face, turning his pale skin a mottled, angry red. He did not ask how I had bypassed the ground floor security. He did not ask why I was wearing a maintenance badge with a fake name. His arrogant mind immediately jumped to the most classist conclusion possible. "What the hell are you doing in my office?" He barked, his voice echoing off the thick glass walls. He took 2 aggressive steps forward, invading my space with his chest puffed out. "Are you looking for loose change, you old beggar?" I kept my head down and let my shoulders slump forward. I needed him to believe his own twisted narrative. I needed him to think I was just a desperate, broke old man who had wandered into the wrong building looking for a handout. I mumbled a fragmented apology. I told him I got lost looking for the service elevator. I let my voice shake just enough to sell the performance of a frail senior citizen. But inside my mind was running a mile a minute. I carefully slipped the flash drive down my sleeve, letting gravity drop it into the depths of my uniform pocket and eventually sliding it down into my sock. I needed to get out of this room with that data at all costs. Preston did not care about my excuses. He saw an opportunity to exert his power and crush a man he already despised. He lunged across the desk and grabbed the collar of my gray uniform. His grip was tight and his knuckles turned white as he yanked me forward, nearly pulling me off balance. I have built entire corporate ecosystems from the ground up. I have destroyed ruthless Wall Street executives with a single phone call. I could have snapped his wrist right then and there. I could have looked him in the eye and ended his entire professional existence with one sentence. But I swallowed my pride. I let him drag me. I let him pull me around the desk and toward the door. "You pathetic piece of trash," he hissed, his breath hot against my face. "You thought you could sneak in here and steal from me. You thought you could steal from my company." I stumbled forward, playing the victim perfectly. I let my knees buckle slightly as he shoved the office door open and dragged me out into the main corridor. The entire executive floor stopped moving. Dozens of junior executives, administrative assistants, and the very security guards who had let me in turned to stare. The clacking of keyboards ceased immediately. The hushed conversations died in the air. The silence was absolute and suffocating, broken only by Preston shouting at the top of his lungs. "Look at this!" Preston yelled for the entire floor to hear. He shoved me forward, making me stumble onto the polished marble floor. I caught myself on a glass partition, keeping my head bowed. Look at what crawled into my office. This is my wife's father, a pathetic, broke old man sneaking around my company like a common thief. Whispers erupted across the large open workspace. I could feel their eyes burning into my back. Some looked with pity, others with disgust. None of them knew they were looking at the man whose name was on their paychecks. I stayed silent. I let my hands tremble visibly against the glass. Preston paced in front of me, soaking in the attention of his subordinates. He was putting on a show, proving his ruthless authority to the people he managed. "I gave you $10,000 to stay out of my life," he sneered, pointing a finger an inch from my face. "I paid you to disappear. And here you are, dressed like a janitor, trying to steal from my desk. You are a complete disgrace. Maya works herself to the bone for you, and this is how you repay her. By humiliating her husband in his own building." I slowly looked up, letting my eyes appear watery and confused. "I am sorry, Preston," I whispered, making my voice crack to feed his massive ego. "I just wanted to see where you worked. I got confused." He laughed. It was a harsh, cruel sound that echoed down the long hallway. "You got confused. You are losing your mind, old man. You are senile and you are a thief." He turned sharply to the two security guards who had rushed over from the elevator bank. "Get this garbage out of my building right now. If he ever steps foot on this property again, do not call me. Call the police. Have him arrested for trespassing and attempted burglary." The two large security guards grabbed my arms. They were rough and eager to please their regional director. They hauled me toward the freight elevators, parading me past rows of staring cubicles. I kept my head down, absorbing the public humiliation. I memorized every insult. I memorized his laugh. I memorized the sneer on his face. They shoved me into the service elevator. The heavy metal doors slid shut, cutting off Preston's smug face from my view. The ride down to the basement level was completely silent. The guards did not speak a single word to me. To them, I was just a crazy old man who had crossed the wrong executive. When the doors finally opened to the concrete loading dock, they pushed me out into the humid Atlanta air. "Do not come back, Pops," one of the guards warned, pointing a heavy flashlight directly at my chest. "The regional director will press charges next time, and we will not be gentle." I stumbled slightly on the concrete loading ramp, nodding silently. I waited until they stepped back inside. I waited until the heavy metal doors slammed shut and the electronic security locks engaged with a loud beep. The moment I was alone, the trembling in my hands stopped entirely. My posture straightened. The frail, confused old man vanished into thin air. I stood tall in the dimly lit parking garage, letting the cold air fill my lungs. I walked purposefully toward my battered Ford truck, parked in the shadows. Preston Cole had just signed his own death warrant. He had dragged me through the mud to make himself feel powerful, but he had failed to check my pockets. I climbed into the cab of my truck and locked the heavy doors. I reached down to my ankle, pulling up the hem of my gray uniform pants. My fingers brushed the cool metal of the encrypted flash drive tucked safely inside my sock. I pulled it out and held it up to the dim light of the dashboard. I reached behind the passenger seat and pulled out my secure laptop. I flipped it open, and the screen illuminated the dark cab. I plugged the drive into the port and entered my master decryption key. The files I had successfully cloned from Preston's machine flooded the screen in a matter of seconds. I did not just have his quarterly expense reports anymore. I had his private internal ledgers. I began cross-referencing the data Marcus had sent me earlier with the raw encrypted files from Preston's hard drive. It took less than 5 minutes for the true nightmare to reveal itself. Preston was not just a greedy executive firing veteran workers to pad his bonus. That was just a convenient smokescreen to hide his real activities. I opened a hidden folder disguised as software licensing agreements. The numbers staring back at me were staggering. Preston had set up a highly sophisticated embezzlement ring right under the nose of my corporate auditors. He was routing millions of dollars in corporate capital through 3 different shell companies based out of the Cayman Islands. He was creating fake logistics contracts, signing them himself as the regional director, and paying out massive monthly retainers to phantom corporations that he secretly controlled. He was draining the lifeblood of the Atlanta branch. He was stealing directly from Carter Holdings. He was stealing from me. I stared at the screen as a chilling smile touched my lips. He was not just a terrible, arrogant son-in-law. He was a federal criminal looking at decades in prison. He thought he had won today by throwing a helpless old man out of his office. He thought he had asserted his dominance. He had no idea he had just handed me the loaded gun I would use to execute his entire career. I closed the laptop and tucked it safely under the seat. I started the engine of the old Ford and pulled out of the parking garage. Preston had shown me exactly who he was. Now it was time to let him dig his grave a little deeper. He thought I was a broken old man losing his mind. I was going to use that exact narrative to trap him in a cage he could never escape. The game of observation was over. The destruction of Preston Cole had officially begun. I drove back to my modest house on the outskirts of Atlanta. The encrypted flash drive was safe in my pocket, holding the digital execution of Preston Cole. But the war was far from over. I knew men like Preston. When they feel threatened, they do not retreat. They double down. They spin the narrative. They manipulate the truth until it becomes a weapon. And I knew exactly who his next target would be. I unlocked my front door and walked into the quiet sanctuary of my home. I had barely taken off my jacket when my phone began to ring. The caller ID showed my daughter's name, Maya. I answered the call, and before I could even say a word, I heard the sound of her heavy, ragged breathing. She was crying. Not just crying, but sobbing with a deep chest, heaving panic that immediately made my blood run cold. "Dad, are you okay? Please tell me you are okay." Her voice was frantic, trembling with a fear that broke my heart. I asked her what was wrong, keeping my voice steady and soothing, the exact way I used to speak to her when she had nightmares as a little girl. She choked on her words, struggling to get them out between her tears. "Preston just came home," she cried. "He said you came to his office building today. He said you were wearing a janitor uniform. Dad. He told me you were wandering around the executive floor, completely lost, looking for a bathroom and mumbling about cleaning the floors." I closed my eyes and gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. Preston was not just covering his tracks. He was actively weaponizing my undercover visit. He was building a defense mechanism. By painting me as a senile, confused old man, he could easily dismiss any claims I might make about his behavior or the embezzlement I had witnessed. It was a classic ruthless corporate maneuver applied directly to his own family. He was gaslighting my daughter. "Dad, he said you were aggressive." Maya continued, her voice shaking. "He said you did not know where you were, and that the security guards had to gently escort you out because you were causing a scene. He is so worried about you." The word worried tasted like poison in my mouth. Preston was not worried. Preston was terrified. He was terrified that I might have seen something, heard something, or that I might actually be a threat to his perfect, pristine image. He was manipulating my daughter's love for me, twisting her genuine concern into a tool to lock me away. "He says it is dementia, Dad," she sobbed. "He says you are showing signs of severe cognitive decline. He sat me down in the living room and said we need to make some very hard decisions. He wants to petition the court to declare you legally incompetent. He said it is for your own safety." A cold, calculated rage washed over me. I stood there in my kitchen listening to the devastating effects of a sociopath at work. Preston, the man who was stealing millions of dollars from my company, the man who was driving luxury cars bought with stolen money, wanted to declare his father-in-law mentally incompetent. He even brought home brochures for a state-run nursing facility on the edge of town. Maya wept. He said, "We need to move fast before you hurt yourself or wander into traffic. He wants to put you in a home, Dad. A cheap public facility because he says we cannot afford private care right now." The sheer audacity of his plan was breathtaking. He wanted to strip me of my human rights. He wanted to take away my independence and lock me in a bleak, underfunded institution just to silence me. He wanted to remove the only perceived stain on his elitist life so he could attend his precious corporate gala without a single worry. He was perfectly willing to destroy an innocent man's life to protect his own lies. "Maya, listen to me," I said, projecting absolute clarity and strength into the phone. "Take a deep breath. I am perfectly fine. I need you to calm down and listen to my voice. Do I sound confused to you? Do I sound like a man who has lost his mind? She sniffled, her breathing slowing down just a fraction. "No," she whispered. "But Preston said you did not even know your own name." Preston overreacted. I told her, keeping my tone light and dismissive. I went downtown to run an errand and ended up near his building. The uniform was just some old work clothes I threw on to do some gardening in the backyard. I got a little turned around in that massive glass tower, that is all. You know how confusing those corporate buildings can be. There is no dementia, Maya. There is no cognitive decline. I am as sharp as a tack, my sweet girl. I could hear the relief washing over her, but the seed of doubt Preston had planted was deeply rooted. "Are you absolutely sure, Dad?" she asked hesitantly. Because Preston was so adamant. He said we need to get power of attorney immediately so he can manage your finances and keep you safe. He said if we do not act now, the state might step in and take your house. He wanted power of attorney over my finances. If Preston Cole only knew the magnitude of the accounts he was trying to access, his greedy heart would probably stop beating on the spot. He thought he was maneuvering to take control of a modest pension and a rundown house. He had no idea he was trying to legally hijack the fortune of a self-made billionaire. "Maya, I need you to promise me something," I said, my voice hardening just enough to convey the absolute seriousness of my request. "Do not sign anything Preston gives you. Absolutely nothing. Do not agree to any doctors, do not agree to any lawyers, and certainly do not agree to any power of attorney documents. Tell him I am resting and that we will discuss it later as a family. Can you do that for me?" She agreed, her voice finally calming down completely. She told me she loved me, that she was just so scared of losing me, and that she would call me tomorrow to check in. I reassured her one last time, told her I loved her more than anything in this world, and ended the call. I set the phone down on the counter. The kitchen was quiet again, but the air felt charged with electricity. Preston was accelerating his timeline. He was panicking. The $10,000 bribe at the restaurant was his first attempt to make me disappear. Throwing me out of his office was his second. Now he was trying to legally erase my existence. He was trying to bury me alive in a nursing home to protect his embezzlement and his promotion. I walked into my living room and looked at the framed photographs on the mantel. Pictures of my late wife Vivian. Pictures of Maya graduating from college, smiling so brightly. I had promised Vivian on her deathbed that I would always protect our little girl. I thought letting her marry a rising corporate star was letting her find stability. I thought Preston, despite his blatant arrogance, would provide a good life for her. But he was a parasite. He was emotionally abusing my daughter, using her as a pawn in a sick game of chess that he thought he was winning. He thought he was playing against a defenseless old black man who had nothing. He thought I was powerless. But real power is not always loud. Real power is silent. Real power is letting your enemy build a trap, completely oblivious to the fact that they are locking themselves inside it. I needed to move to the next phase of my plan. I needed to cut off the financial oxygen to his embezzlement scheme before he could funnel the stolen money into untraceable offshore accounts. I needed to tighten the noose around his neck until he could no longer breathe. I walked back toward the kitchen to grab my secure laptop. I was preparing to send an encrypted message to my legal team to freeze the Apex Logistics Atlanta accounts immediately. But before my fingers could touch the keyboard, a sudden sharp sound broke the silence of the house. The doorbell rang. It was a harsh, intrusive sound that echoed through the small hallway. I frowned. I was not expecting any visitors. Maya was at home dealing with her manipulative husband, and I rarely had guests at this hour of the afternoon. The doorbell rang a second time. It was longer and much more insistent. This was followed by a heavy, impatient knocking on the solid wood of my front door. It was the kind of knock that demanded immediate attention, the kind of knock that belonged to people who believed the world revolved around their schedule. I walked quietly to the front door and peered through the small glass peephole. Standing on my front porch, looking completely out of place in my working-class neighborhood, were Richard and Camilla Cole. Richard was wearing a tailored golf shirt, his face flushed with irritation as he looked around at my modest yard with unconcealed disgust. Camilla stood beside him, clutching her expensive designer handbag tightly to her chest, as if she were afraid the very air in my neighborhood would infect her with poverty. But it was not their arrogant presence that made my blood run cold. It was what Richard was holding in his hands. He was clutching a thick stack of legal documents neatly bound in a crisp manila folder. I knew exactly what those papers were. Preston had sent his parents to do his dirty work. They had come to force the confused, senile old man to sign his life away. They had come to strip me of my rights in my own home. I took a deep breath, adjusted my posture to look just a little bit more frail, and reached for the doorknob. The real game was about to begin. I never told my son-in-law I was the CEO of the multi-billion-dollar company he worked for. To him, I was just Julian Carter, an old, broke black man living on a fixed pension in a rundown house. When he invited me to a fancy dinner with his wealthy white parents, I wanted to see how they would treat a man they thought had nothing. Halfway through the meal, his mother looked at me with pure disgust, slid a white envelope across the table, and told me I was an embarrassment. 2 minutes later, sitting in my old truck, I made a single phone call that would systematically dismantle their perfect, arrogant lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. The heavy knocking on my front door did not stop. It was the frantic, entitled pounding of people who believed their time was infinitely more valuable than mine. I took a slow, deep breath, letting my shoulders droop, and my hands develop a slight tremor. The billionaire chairman vanished, and the fragile, confused senior citizen took his place. I reached out and turned the deadbolt. Before I could even open the door fully, Richard Cole pushed his weight against the wood, forcing his way into my hallway. Camilla followed right on his heels, clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest as if the very air inside my home was contaminated. They did not wait for an invitation. They did not offer a greeting. They marched directly into my living room with the arrogant stride of conquerors stepping onto conquered land. I closed the front door quietly and turned to face them. "What is going on, Richard?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and laced with a manufactured vulnerability. "Why are you here?" Richard did not answer immediately. He was too busy looking around my modest living room with a sneer of absolute disgust on his face. He took in the faded fabric of my sofa, the old analog television set, and the worn rug beneath his expensive leather shoes. He looked at my home not as a place where a man had built a life and raised a daughter, but as a miserable shack that offended his upper-class sensibilities. Camilla could not hide her impatience. She sighed loudly and crossed her arms. "Julian, we do not have time for pleasantries," she snapped. "We are here to handle a family crisis that you have unfortunately created." Richard stepped forward and tossed a thick manila folder onto my small wooden coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud that echoed in the quiet room. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and looked down at me with a gaze full of false pity. "We know what happened today." Julian Richard began using the slow, patronizing tone one might use to speak to a disobedient child. "Preston told us everything. He told us how you wandered into his corporate building dressed in a janitor uniform. He told us how you were confused, causing a scene in front of his executives and looking for things that were not there." I looked down at my worn slippers, pretending to look ashamed. "I just wanted to see where he worked," I mumbled, letting my voice waver. "You are losing your mind, Julian," Richard stated flatly, cutting off my excuse. "It is hard to admit, but you are showing severe signs of cognitive decline. You are a danger to yourself, and quite frankly, you are a massive liability to our son. Preston is on the verge of the biggest promotion of his life. The regional CEO position is practically his. We cannot have a mentally unstable father-in-law wandering the streets and destroying his reputation." I looked up at him, keeping the mask of fear on my face, but inside my mind was calculating every single word he spoke. They were executing Preston's gaslighting strategy perfectly. They were using my undercover audit as ammunition to strip me of my autonomy. "What is in the folder, Richard?" I asked, pointing a trembling finger at the documents on the table. Camilla stepped forward, tapping her manicured nails against the manila envelope. "These are the solutions to your problem, Julian. Inside are medical proxy forms, a comprehensive power of attorney, and a property transfer deed. We have already spoken to a lawyer." Richard crossed his arms and stared me down. "You are going to sign the house over to Preston today, Julian. Your mind is going, and you can no longer manage your own affairs. The sale of this shack will cover the entry fees for a state-run nursing facility on the edge of the county. We found a place that will take you. It is modest, but it is what you can afford. This way, you will be supervised, and you will not burden our son or your daughter ever again." The sheer ruthlessness of their plan was staggering. They wanted to seize the only asset they thought I possessed, kick me out of the home I had lived in for 40 years, and lock me away in a bleak, underfunded institution just so Preston could maintain his polished corporate image. They were standing in my living room trying to legally rob me blind. I looked at the folder and then back at Richard. "I cannot sign my house away," I said, letting my voice crack with panic. "This is my home. Vivian and I raised Maya here. Maya would never agree to this. Where is Maya? Why is my daughter not here to talk to me about this?" Camilla rolled her eyes and let out a harsh laugh. "Oh, please, Julian, do not bring Maya into this. Maya is an emotional wreck because of your behavior. She is working herself to the bone and she cannot think clearly right now. Preston is the head of the household. Preston makes the executive decisions to protect his family. He has the legal team ready to process these documents by tomorrow morning." I took a step back, shaking my head slowly. "I will not sign them," I whispered, shrinking away from the table. "I need to talk to a doctor first. I need to talk to my daughter. You cannot just come into my house and take everything from me." Richard stepped closer, closing the distance between us. His face grew red and the false pity vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, aggressive menace. "You listen to me, you old fool," he threatened, pointing a finger directly at my chest. "You do not have a choice. If you do not sign these papers voluntarily, Preston will take this to a judge. He will testify about your erratic behavior. He will bring in the security guards from his building to testify that you are a trespassing lunatic. The court will strip you of your rights entirely, and the state will auction this house off to pay for your wardship. You will have absolutely nothing. Sign the papers, Julian." I stared at the pen Richard pulled from his jacket pocket and slammed onto the table next to the folder. I had spent decades sitting across from ruthless corporate raiders, hostile takeover specialists, and Wall Street sharks. I knew a weak negotiation when I saw one. Richard and Camilla were pressing too hard. They were rushing the close. They did not just want to get rid of a bothersome father-in-law. There was a desperate, frantic energy radiating from both of them. They needed this house. They needed the meager equity they thought it held. "Why the rush, Richard?" I asked, dropping the stutter from my voice just slightly. "Why do you need this house sold by next week? It is just an old shack, right? It is not worth that much." Camilla lost her composure entirely. Her face twisted with rage, and she stepped in front of her husband, completely dropping the facade of concern. "Because Preston needs liquidity, you stubborn old fool," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the walls of my living room. Richard grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back. "Camilla, stop," he hissed, but she was too furious to listen. She yanked her arm away and glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "No, Richard, I am sick of pretending," she yelled, pointing at me. "You are ruining his future, Julian. Preston has debts. He has obligations to maintain his lifestyle, and your daughter does not bring in nearly enough money to support the image he needs for this promotion. He has loans that are calling due this week. He needs the cash from the sale of this house to cover his margins before the corporate auditors at Apex review his background for the CEO position. If he defaults on his personal loans, they will pass him over for the promotion. You owe him this, Julian. He took your daughter off your hands. Now sign the damn papers and get out of his way." The room fell dead silent. Richard stood frozen, his eyes wide with panic as he realized exactly what his wife had just confessed. Camilla stood there breathing heavily, her chest heaving with rage, completely oblivious to the magnitude of the mistake she had just made. I stood motionless in the center of my living room. The fragile, confused old man evaporated from my posture completely. I straightened my back, pulling myself up to my full height. I rolled my shoulders back and looked down at the two arrogant parasites standing in my home. "Preston has debts," I repeated softly. My voice was no longer shaking. It was deep calm and as cold as ice. Preston needs liquidity to cover his margins before the auditors look into his background." Richard swallowed hard, taking a step back as he noticed the sudden shift in my demeanor. "Julian," he stammered, trying to recover, "do not misunderstand what she is saying. Businessmen have expenses. It is just a temporary cash flow issue. You signing the house over is just the most efficient way to handle your medical care while simultaneously helping the family portfolio." I looked at the power of attorney documents lying on my coffee table. Then I looked at Camilla, who was suddenly looking very unsure of herself as she watched the fear creep into her husband's eyes. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice slicing through the tension in the room. And you are going to leave my house right now before I call the police and have you both arrested for trespassing and attempted extortion." Richard's jaw clenched. "You are making a massive mistake, Julian. You think you can fight us. You think a broke old man with a rotting brain can go to court against my son? We will destroy you. We will take this house and we will lock you away in a ward where they strap you to a bed. Let us go, Camilla." He grabbed his wife by the arm and pulled her toward the front door. They stormed out of my house, slamming the heavy wooden door behind them with enough force to rattle the windows. I stood in the silence of my living room, listening to the tires of their luxury sedan screech against the pavement as they sped away from my curb. They thought they had left me terrified. They thought they had delivered a devastating ultimatum. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed me the final nail for their son's coffin. I slowly raised my right hand and reached toward the front breast pocket of my frayed corduroy jacket. I slipped my fingers inside and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was illuminated, showing a bright red recording icon. The timer ticked past the 15-minute mark. I tapped the red square to stop the recording and hit save. I now had high-definition, crystal-clear audio of Camilla Cole admitting that her son was drowning in hidden debts. I had verbal confirmation that Preston was attempting to illegally extort a senior citizen to defraud his corporate auditors and secure a promotion he did not deserve. I had the motive, the method, and the confession all neatly packaged in a digital file. I walked into my kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water. I looked out the window at the setting Atlanta sun. Preston was trying to steal my house to cover the very embezzlement I was already investigating. The arrogance was almost poetic. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus. The proxy CEO answered on the first ring. "Marcus," I said, staring out at the darkening sky. "The observation phase is officially over. It is time to freeze the veins." I stood by the front window of my living room and watched the luxury sedan belonging to Richard and Camilla Cole disappear down the street. They drove away completely convinced they had backed a helpless old man into a corner. They thought their aggressive threats and their cheap legal documents had terrified me into submission. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy their son. I pulled my phone from the pocket of my frayed corduroy jacket and dialed a secure direct line to the executive finance division of Carter Holdings. The phone rang exactly one time before Marcus answered. I did not exchange pleasantries. I told Marcus the observation phase was over, and it was time to cut the financial arteries. I ordered him to freeze all discretionary spending for the Atlanta branch of Apex Logistics immediately. I told him to cancel every single corporate credit card assigned to Preston Cole and lock his internal expense accounts. Marcus asked if he should notify the corporate fraud department and get the authorities involved right now. I told him absolutely not. I wanted this done completely quietly. I explained to Marcus that when you want to destroy a parasite, you do not rip it out immediately because it might survive. You slowly choke off its blood supply and wait for it to panic. And panic always breeds fatal mistakes. I walked into my kitchen and opened my secure laptop. I logged into the master financial dashboard of my empire. From this screen, I could monitor the real-time transaction data of every single executive under my umbrella. It was early afternoon, and I knew exactly where Preston was. He was not at his office managing his team. My private investigator had been tracking him since morning. Preston was across town at an exclusive European auto dealership. He was so incredibly arrogant and so certain that his promotion to regional CEO was guaranteed at the upcoming gala that he was already spending the bonus he was never going to receive. He was shopping for a custom Porsche. I sat at my kitchen table watching the digital map of incoming authorization requests. I knew Preston was standing in a gleaming showroom trying to act like a master of the universe. He was probably looking down at the sales staff the same way he looked down at me. I watched the cursor blink on my screen as the dealership system initiated a massive hold for a down payment. Preston was attempting to use his primary executive corporate account. This was an account he had been illegally draining for months to fund his fake logistics consulting firms. I did not hesitate. With one simple keystroke, I denied the transaction. A red error code flashed on my secure terminal. I smiled bitterly. My private investigator sent me a detailed report of the fallout later that evening. The investigator was sitting in the customer lounge drinking coffee and watching the entire scene unfold. He reported that Preston had walked into the dealership acting like he owned the entire city. He demanded the newest, most expensive model right off the showroom floor. He bypassed the standard sales representatives and demanded to speak directly to the finance manager. When the finance manager ran the black corporate card and informed Preston that it was declined, Preston laughed it off. He told the manager with a condescending smirk that their machine must be broken and ordered him to run it again. The manager swiped the card a second time, declined again. The investigator reported that the smug smile completely vanished from the face of my son-in-law. Preston grew visibly agitated. His face turned a deep shade of angry red. He snatched the corporate card back and pulled out a personal platinum credit card. I knew everything about that personal card. It was the account tied directly to his offshore shell companies where he was laundering my money. Preston did not know that I had frozen that account too. I had made a quiet phone call to our banking partners earlier that morning. When the finance manager ran the personal platinum card, the machine beeped loudly and flashed another denial. The investigator noted that Preston completely lost his temper. He started screaming at the finance manager, calling him an incompetent fool. He threw a massive tantrum right there on the pristine showroom floor in front of several wealthy clients and the entire sales staff. He demanded that they release the car to him based on his title alone. The dealership manager had no patience for a man whose credit cards were bouncing. He asked Preston to lower his voice, and when Preston refused, the manager called the dealership security guards. They had to physically escort Preston Cole off the property. He was humiliated and thrown out into the hot Atlanta sun like a common vagrant. Preston stormed over to his current vehicle and slammed the door. He sat in the driver's seat sweating profusely and pulled out his phone. He immediately dialed the corporate finance office at Apex Logistics, demanding to speak to someone in charge. I had already anticipated this move. I had personally briefed the senior clerk in the finance department on exactly how to handle his call. When Preston started yelling at the clerk demanding to know why his corporate and personal accounts were suddenly shut down, the clerk remained completely calm and strictly professional. She told him that his accounts had been placed under a routine security review. Preston demanded that the block be lifted immediately, claiming he was the future regional CEO and that he needed access to his funds for vital company business. The clerk politely informed him that she did not have the authorization to override a system-wide security protocol. She told him it was a standard procedure prior to major executive promotions and that the financial freeze would remain in effect for at least 72 hours. Preston hung up the phone in a blind panic. To a normal, hardworking executive, a 3-day financial freeze is nothing more than a minor administrative inconvenience. But to a man running a multi-million-dollar embezzlement ring with hidden illegal debts, a 72-hour freeze is an absolute death sentence. Preston was using the stolen corporate funds to pay off his fake consulting firms on a weekly basis. Those fake firms were nothing more than elaborate fronts for very dangerous people. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to underground creditors who had helped him finance his lavish lifestyle and his bad investments before he figured out how to steal from my company. Those dangerous people did not accept routine security reviews as a valid excuse for a missed payment. Preston needed liquidity immediately. He needed hundreds of thousands of dollars by the end of the day, or his creditors were going to come looking for him. His back was entirely against the wall. His corporate money was gone. His personal laundered money was locked. His wealthy parents did not have the kind of liquid cash he needed because they spent all their money maintaining the illusion of high society wealth. Preston had only one valuable asset left in his entire world. He had the house he shared with my daughter. I have kept a silent, protective alert on my daughter's social security number and credit profile ever since she left for college. It was a fatherly safeguard I never told her about because I wanted her to feel independent, but I always wanted to ensure she was safe from predatory lenders. Late that evening, as I was finishing my dinner, my phone chimed with a high-priority digital alert from a major national lending institution. Someone was running an aggressive hard credit check on Maya Cole. Someone was actively submitting an application for a massive second mortgage on the residential property she shared with Preston. I looked at the clock on my wall. It was 8 o'clock at night. Maya was currently in the middle of a grueling 12-hour shift at the local hospital. She was on her feet taking care of sick patients. She was absolutely nowhere near a computer or a bank. The reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow. The cold, calculating billionaire vanished and the furious, protective father took his place. Preston was desperate. He had driven home to their empty house, dug through their personal filing cabinets, and found her identification documents. He was sitting at his computer actively forging my daughter's signature on a massive loan application to save his own skin. He was perfectly willing to put the woman he supposedly loved into hundreds of thousands of dollars of crippling debt just to cover up his own corporate crimes and pay off his loan sharks. He was entirely willing to destroy her future so he could survive until the corporate gala. I stood up from my kitchen table, knocking my chair backward onto the floor. The trap I was building was no longer just about protecting Carter Holdings from a greedy executive. It was no longer just about teaching an arrogant family a lesson in humility. It was deeply and intensely personal. Preston Cole had crossed the final line. He had targeted my little girl. He was trying to use Maya as a human shield to absorb the financial explosion he had created. I walked toward my front door, grabbing my keys. The time for quiet observation was completely over. It was time to pull Maya out of the wreckage before Preston could drag her down into the abyss with him. I never told my son-in-law I was the CEO of the multi-billion-dollar company he worked for. To him, I was just Julian Carter, an old broke black man living on a fixed pension in a rundown house. When he invited me to a fancy dinner with his wealthy white parents, I wanted to see how they would treat a man they thought had nothing. Halfway through the meal, his mother looked at me with pure disgust, slid a white envelope across the table, and told me I was an embarrassment. 2 minutes later, sitting in my old truck, I made a single phone call that would systematically dismantle their perfect, arrogant lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. I pulled my old Ford truck into the parking lot of a quiet diner on the outskirts of Atlanta. The neon sign buzzed overhead. It was a place where working-class people came to eat after a long shift. It was not the kind of place a man like Preston Cole would ever step foot in. That made it the perfect place for a meeting. I walked inside and took a seat in a booth at the very back. The waitress poured me a cup of black coffee and left me alone. A few minutes later, a man slid into the booth across from me. His name was David. He was one of the most ruthless and expensive private investigators in the country. On paper, David worked as an independent contractor. In reality, he was on the exclusive payroll of Carter Holdings. I paid him a very large retainer to handle the problems that required absolute discretion and absolute silence. David did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how I was doing. He simply reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. He placed it on the scratched laminate table and slid it across to me. The folder felt heavy. It felt like a loaded weapon. "I have been tracking your son-in-law for 72 hours straight, Julian," David said in a low voice. "You told me to look into his financial movements. You told me he was desperate for liquidity to cover his margins. But the truth is much worse than corporate embezzlement. He is not just stealing to cover bad business investments. He is bleeding your company dry to fund a completely parallel life." I took a sip of my black coffee. I did not show any emotion. I simply opened the folder and began to review the documents. The first thing I saw was a stack of high-resolution photographs. The images were crisp and clear. They showed Preston Cole walking into the lobby of the most expensive luxury hotel in downtown Atlanta. He was not alone. Hanging on his arm was a young blonde woman. She looked no older than 24. She was wearing a tight designer dress and laughing at something Preston said. In the next photograph, they were standing at the hotel registration desk. Preston had his hand resting on her lower back in a way that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. I turned the page. There were more photographs. Pictures of them sitting in a dimly lit VIP lounge drinking expensive champagne. Pictures of them entering a private elevator. Pictures of them kissing in the hotel parking garage. I stared at the images of the man who had stood at an altar and promised to love and protect my daughter. I felt a cold, hard stone form in the center of my chest. Corporate theft was a business problem. I could handle a thief. I crushed thieves every single day in the boardroom. But this was different. This was a profound betrayal of my blood. "Look at the financial documents behind the photos," David instructed quietly. "I followed the money just like you asked." It was not easy. He tried to hide it through 3 different shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, but he is sloppy. He used the same routing numbers for his corporate expense account and his personal luxury purchases. I pulled out a stack of bank statements and wire transfer receipts. David had highlighted several transactions in red ink. My eyes locked onto a specific purchase made just 2 days ago. It was a receipt from an elite high-end jewelry boutique in the city. The total purchase price was $50,000. I read the item description. It was a custom diamond necklace. "He bought it for her," David explained. "The girl in the photos." I tracked the transaction all the way back to the source. He funneled $50,000 out of the Apex Logistics warehouse safety budget. He routed it through a fake consulting firm. Then he wired the clean money directly to his personal platinum credit card to buy the diamonds. He literally stole the safety equipment budget from your warehouse workers to buy jewelry for his mistress. I closed the folder. The anger inside me was no longer a simmering fire. It was absolute zero. It was a freezing, paralyzing calm. I had spent decades building Carter Holdings. I had scrubbed warehouse floors until my hands bled. I had skipped meals so I could make payroll for my employees. I built an empire so my daughter would never have to know the struggles I faced. I looked down at the closed folder. My mind drifted back 10 years. I remembered sitting in a sterile white hospital room holding the frail hand of my wife, Vivian. The cancer had taken almost everything from her, but it could never take the fierce protective light in her eyes. She knew she was dying. She looked at me with her final breaths and made me swear an oath. She told me that Maya was too trusting. She told me that Maya had a heart of pure gold and that the world was full of men who would try to exploit her light. Vivian made me promise that I would always protect our little girl. She made me promise that I would stand between Maya and anyone who tried to break her heart. I promised her. I looked into the eyes of the only woman I ever truly loved, and I swore I would burn the world down before I let anyone hurt our daughter. Sitting in that diner, I realized I had failed. I had let Preston Cole into our family. I had stepped back and played the role of the quiet, retired father because I thought it was what Maya wanted. I thought he was just an arrogant social climber. I thought his worst crime was being a snob. But he was a monster. He was a parasite feeding off my daughter's love while stealing my money to sleep with a woman half his age. I slid the folder back toward David. Keep tracking him, I ordered. I want to know exactly where he is at all times. I want a complete digital footprint of every single transaction he makes for the next 48 hours. Do not let him out of your sight. David nodded and put the folder back into his briefcase. You understand that if you take this to the authorities right now, he will go to federal prison for a very long time, David said. The embezzlement alone is enough to put him away for 20 years. The fraud adds another 10. You have the bullet, Julian. You just need to pull the trigger. I am not going to pull the trigger yet, I replied, staring at the black coffee in my mug. Going to the police right now is too easy. If I hand him over to the authorities, he gets to play the victim. He gets to hire expensive defense lawyers and drag my company through a public trial. He gets to drag Maya through the mud. No, I am not going to arrest him. I am going to publicly execute his entire existence. I am going to let him walk into his precious corporate gala thinking he is the king of the world. And then I am going to strip the flesh from his bones in front of every single executive he has ever tried to impress. David stood up from the booth. He understood. He knew the kind of man I was. I will keep the surveillance active, he said. I will send you real-time updates. He walked out of the diner, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat there for another 10 minutes. I was meticulously planning the sequence of events that would unfold over the next few days. I had to orchestrate the destruction of Preston Cole with absolute precision. I had to make sure his parents, Richard and Camilla, went down with him. They had enabled his arrogance. They had sat at that fancy French restaurant and handed me a $10,000 bribe to hide like a shameful secret. They were going to pay for every single insult. I stood up and left a $20 bill on the table. I walked out of the diner and got back into my old Ford truck. The engine roared to life. I pulled out onto the highway heading back toward my house. I needed to figure out how to tell Maya. Breaking the news of the infidelity to my daughter was going to be the hardest thing I had ever done. It was going to break her heart. But it was a necessary pain. I had to pull her out of the burning building before the entire structure collapsed. I was planning to drive to her house that evening to sit her down and show her the photographs. I wanted to be the one to hold her when her world shattered. But Preston Cole was always one step ahead in his own self-destruction. He was a desperate man backed into a corner by his own hidden debts. And desperate men never wait for the axe to fall. They try to outrun it. I was halfway home when my cell phone began to ring. The sound shattered the quiet focus inside the cab of my truck. I glanced down at the screen. It was Maya. I answered the call, expecting to hear her usual cheerful voice. I expected her to ask me what I was making for dinner, or if I wanted to come over and watch a movie. Instead, I heard a sound that made the blood freeze in my veins. She was screaming. It was not the soft crying of a woman who had a bad day at work. It was the visceral, panicked screaming of a person whose entire reality was crumbling beneath her feet. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air between her words. "Dad," she cried, her voice cracking with pure terror. "Dad, you have to help me. Please, you have to come over right now," Maya breathed. I commanded, my voice instantly dropping into a low, soothing register. I am on my way. Tell me what is happening. Are you hurt? Did Preston do something to you? The mention of his name unleashed a fresh wave of sobbing. He is gone, Dad. Preston is gone. He packed a suitcase and left an hour ago. He said he had to go fix a massive work emergency and he rushed out the door. He took his passport, Dad. Why would he take his passport for a work emergency? I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I pushed the accelerator down, forcing the old truck to speed up. He is running, I thought to myself. The financial freezes I put on his accounts had terrified him. He knew his loan sharks were coming for him and he was trying to flee the country. Maya, listen to me, I said. You are safe. I am 5 minutes away. Why are you panicking like this? Because the bank just called me, she wailed, her voice echoing through the phone speaker. The bank just called me, Dad. Our house is in foreclosure. The bank manager said we are hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. They said we took out a massive second mortgage yesterday, and that the funds were instantly transferred to an offshore account. I did not sign any mortgage, Dad. I was at the hospital working a double shift. I felt a cold rage explode inside my chest. The private investigator had warned me that Preston might try something desperate, but I never imagined he would move this fast. He had actually done it. He had forged his own wife's signature to steal the equity out of their shared home. He had stolen her safe haven to pay off his criminal debts and fund his escape with his 24-year-old mistress. He drained our savings. Dad. Maya continued sobbing uncontrollably. The joint accounts are completely empty. The emergency fund is gone. Everything is gone. He took every single penny we had. I tried calling his phone, but it goes straight to voicemail. He will not answer his phone. I do not understand what is happening. We are going to lose the house. We have absolutely nothing left. The sound of my daughter weeping in absolute despair was the final catalyst. The observation was over. The strategic planning was over. Preston Cole had crossed the point of no return. He had chosen to destroy my daughter to save himself. I am pulling into your driveway right now, Maya, I said, my voice a low, dangerous whisper. Stay right where you are. I am coming inside. I never told my son-in-law I was the CEO of the multi-billion-dollar company he worked for. To him, I was just Julian Carter, an old broke black man living on a fixed pension in a rundown house. When he invited me to a fancy dinner with his wealthy white parents, I wanted to see how they would treat a man they thought had nothing. Halfway through the meal, his mother looked at me with pure disgust, slid a white envelope across the table, and told me I was an embarrassment. 2 minutes later, sitting in my old truck, I made a single phone call that would systematically dismantle their perfect, arrogant lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and forced my old truck to tear down the polished suburban streets of my daughter's neighborhood. The manicured lawns and perfect two-story houses blurred past my window. It was a neighborhood built on illusions of safety and success. A place where men like Preston Cole hid their rot behind expensive landscaping and luxury cars parked in wide driveways. My heart was a heavy drum in my chest. The strategic billionaire who had been meticulously planning a corporate execution was entirely gone. In his place was only a father racing against time to save his only child. I threw the truck into park the moment I reached her driveway. The tires screeched against the concrete. I did not even bother taking the keys out of the ignition. I sprinted up the front walkway and grabbed the brass handle of the heavy wooden door. It was unlocked. That single fact sent a spike of pure dread straight into my blood. Preston was always obsessed with security and image. For him to leave the front door wide open meant he had left in a blind, reckless panic. I pushed the door open and stepped into the grand foyer. The house was dead silent. There was no sound of the television. There was no hum of the air conditioning. It was the suffocating silence that always follows a sudden, violent storm. I called out my daughter's name. My voice echoed off the high ceilings and the expensive artwork Preston had bought with my stolen money. There was no answer. I hurried toward the living room and stopped dead in my tracks. The perfect designer space was completely destroyed. A heavy glass vase was shattered across the hardwood floor. A side table was overturned with magazines and framed photographs scattered everywhere. And sitting in the center of the wreckage, clutching her knees to her chest, was Maya. She was trembling violently. Her beautiful face was buried in her arms, and the sound of her quiet, broken sobs tore a hole straight through my soul. I rushed across the room, ignoring the crunch of broken glass beneath my boots, and dropped to my knees beside her. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her tightly against my chest. She collapsed into me, burying her face in my old corduroy jacket, crying with a profound, devastating despair. I told her she was safe. I held her and rocked her slowly, waiting for the panic to subside enough for her to speak. It took several minutes before she could catch her breath. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were red and swollen. Her entire world had been ripped away in the span of a single afternoon, and the shock was radiating from every inch of her body. I asked her exactly what happened. I kept my voice low and steady, anchoring her to my calm. She swallowed hard and told me that right after the bank called her, Preston had burst through the front door. She said he was sweating through his expensive suit. He was frantic, tearing through the house, throwing drawers open and ripping documents out of their filing cabinets. She told me he was frantically looking for his passport and a hidden stash of cash he kept in his home office. Maya said she stood in the doorway and confronted him. She asked him why the bank was threatening foreclosure. She asked him why the joint savings accounts were completely drained and where the hundreds of thousands of dollars had gone. She begged him to explain why he had forged her signature to take out a second mortgage on their home without telling her. When she demanded answers, Preston did not apologize. He did not break down and confess his crimes to the woman he supposedly loved. Instead, Maya told me he turned into an absolute monster. He screamed at her. He blamed her for not making enough money at the hospital. He blamed her for his mounting debts, claiming that he had to take out those loans to provide the lifestyle she expected. It was the ultimate narcissistic manipulation. He was stealing from my company to buy diamonds for his 24-year-old mistress, and yet he looked his innocent wife in the eye and told her she was the reason they were bankrupt. Maya said she tried to block the doorway to his office. She told him he was not leaving the house until he called the bank and fixed the mess he had created. She demanded the truth. As Maya spoke, a chill washed over me. She reached up to wipe a tear from her cheek, and the sleeve of her sweater slipped down. That was when I saw it. Dark purple and harsh red marks were blooming rapidly across her upper arm. The shape of the bruise was unmistakable. It was the exact shape of a man's fingers grabbing human flesh with violent, brutal force. I stopped breathing. The air in the room felt suddenly freezing cold. I gently took her arm and looked at the bruise. I asked her what he did to her. My voice was no longer a comforting whisper. It was a flat, dead sound. Dead. Maya looked away in shame. She sobbed and confessed that when she blocked the door, Preston had grabbed her by the arm. He squeezed her so hard she thought her bone would snap. Then he shoved her violently out of his way. He threw her backward against the heavy wooden doorframe. She hit the wall hard enough to knock the breath out of her lungs and fell to the floor. He stood over her, looked down with absolute disgust, and told her he was leaving to fix the problem she was too stupid to understand. Then he stormed out of the house, leaving her alone in the wreckage. I stared at the dark bruises forming on my daughter's skin. In that exact fraction of a second, every single trace of mercy left my body. Up until this moment, this was a corporate war. It was a game of financial chess. I had planned to ruin his career. I had planned to humiliate him at the gala and watch his arrogant parents lose their precious status. I wanted to teach him a lesson about greed and hubris. But Preston Cole had put his hands on my child. He had physically assaulted the little girl I promised my dying wife I would protect at all costs. The game of observation was completely over. The strategic lesson was canceled. This was no longer a hostile takeover. It was an execution. I stood up from the floor. I did not yell. I did not curse his name. The silence of absolute rage is far more dangerous than any screaming match. I reached down and helped Maya to her feet. I told her to go upstairs and pack a single bag. I told her to take only her most essential items and leave everything else behind. She looked at me confused and terrified. She asked me where we were going and what we were going to do about the house and the foreclosure. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her that this house was nothing but brick and wood. I told her that she was coming with me, and she was never spending another night under this roof. I instructed her to hand me her cell phone. I took the device from her trembling hands and completely powered it down. I told her she was not to answer any calls from Preston or his parents. He no longer existed in her world. Maya nodded slowly. She saw the shift in my demeanor. She had always known me as a gentle, quiet man who worked hard and kept his head down. She had never seen the man who ruthlessly eliminated billionaire competitors to build a global supply chain empire. She went upstairs to pack her belongings without asking another question. While she was upstairs, I walked into Preston's ransacked home office. The floor was covered in discarded paperwork and empty folders. He was a coward running from the consequences of his own arrogance. I reached into my corduroy jacket and pulled out my secure mobile device. I bypassed my standard contacts and dialed a direct, unlisted number. It was a number most people did not even know existed. The phone rang once. A sharp voice answered, identifying himself as Special Agent Vance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division in Atlanta. He was the lead agent in charge of massive corporate fraud syndicates. Agent Vance, I said, my voice echoing coldly in Preston's ruined office. My name is Julian Carter. I am the sole owner and chairman of Carter Holdings. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. The agent recognized my name immediately. Mr. Carter, he replied, his tone shifting to absolute professional attention. What can the Bureau do for you tonight? I am calling to report a massive ongoing embezzlement ring operating within my logistics subsidiary, I stated flatly. The prime suspect is the regional director of the Atlanta branch. His name is Preston Cole. He has been laundering millions of corporate dollars through offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He is currently involved with illegal underground lenders and has recently committed identity theft and mortgage fraud. The agent began typing rapidly on his keyboard. Mr. Carter, we will need substantial evidence to move on an executive of that level. We need a paper trail to initiate an arrest warrant. I have a delivery for you, Agent Vance, I replied, my eyes scanning the mess Preston had left behind. I have an encrypted digital drive containing his entire cloned hard drive. It includes his internal ledgers, the fake consulting contracts, his offshore routing numbers, and the forged loan documents. It is a complete digital confession wrapped with a bow. I could hear the agent stop typing. He knew I was handing him the biggest career-making case of his decade. Where are these files, Mr. Carter? I will have my private investigator deliver the physical drive to your field office in exactly 1 hour, I told him. I will also provide you with the decryption key. But I have one very specific condition regarding his arrest. The agent asked what the condition was. I told him that Preston Cole was currently attempting to secure emergency funds to cover his margins. I told the agent that if Preston failed to secure those funds, he would inevitably show up at my corporate anniversary gala this coming weekend. He was desperate to meet the chairman to secure a promotion he thought would save his life. I want your agents dressed in civilian attire at the Four Seasons Ballroom this Saturday night, I commanded. I do not want him picked up at an airport. I do not want him arrested quietly in a hotel room. I want him to walk into the brightest spotlight of his life. I want you to let him stand in front of the entire corporate elite of this city. And then I want your agents to put him in handcuffs in front of 500 witnesses. I want his destruction to be spectacular. Agent Vance agreed without hesitation. If the evidence on this drive is as concrete as you say, Mr. Carter, we will gladly accommodate the venue for the arrest. We will set the trap. I ended the call just as Maya walked down the stairs holding a small duffel bag. Her face was pale and she looked exhausted. I took the bag from her shoulder and wrapped my arm securely around her. I guided her out the front door and locked it behind us. I walked her to my battered Ford truck and helped her climb inside the cab. I started the engine and drove away from the shattered illusion of her marriage. Preston Cole had pushed his luck as far as it could possibly go. He had taken my money. He had insulted my dignity. But he had made the fatal mistake of putting his hands on my daughter. The time for silent shadow audits was over. The stage was set for the gala. The executioners were standing by. And Preston Cole was going to walk blindly right into the center of the slaughterhouse. I never told my son-in-law I was the CEO of the multi-billion-dollar company he worked for. To him, I was just Julian Carter, an old broke black man living on a fixed pension in a run-down house. When he invited me to a fancy dinner with his wealthy white parents, I wanted to see how they would treat a man they thought had nothing. Halfway through the meal, his mother looked at me with pure disgust, slid a white envelope across the table, and told me I was an embarrassment. 2 minutes later, sitting in my old truck, I made a single phone call that would systematically dismantle their perfect, arrogant lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. It was the morning of the corporate gala. The sun rose over Atlanta, illuminating a city built on ambition and deceit. Preston Cole woke up in an empty house. His wife had left him. His corporate credit cards were frozen. His personal bank accounts were locked down tightly by my shadow audit. He had zero liquidity and a mountain of hidden debt. A normal man would have surrendered. A normal man would have realized the game was over. But Preston was entirely fueled by a toxic, arrogant delusion. He believed he was invincible. He believed that tonight he would shake the hand of the elusive chairman of Carter Holdings and be crowned the regional executive officer. He just needed to survive the next 12 hours and project the ultimate illusion of success. To maintain that illusion, Preston did the most desperate and foolish thing a cornered animal could do. My private investigator tracked him to an abandoned industrial lot on the south side of the city early that morning. Preston did not go to a bank. He went to the very loan sharks he already owed money to. He groveled. He begged. He signed predatory extortion agreements with dangerous men who did not care about corporate titles. He borrowed a massive sum of dirty cash at an astronomical interest rate just to secure his appearance for one single night. He took that illegal cash and walked straight into a luxury menswear boutique. He rented a custom-fitted tuxedo that cost more than what my warehouse workers made in a month. He paid up front for a stretched black limousine to chauffeur him to the event. He was constructing a magnificent house of cards on a foundation soaked in gasoline. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that I was already holding the match. Across town, his parents, Richard and Camilla Cole, were busy performing their own pathetic charade. My investigator placed an operative at their exclusive country club to monitor their movements. They were sitting on the sunlit terrace of the clubhouse, sipping expensive mimosas and holding court with their wealthy elite friends. They were loudly bragging to anyone who would listen about their brilliant son. Camilla boasted about how Preston was ascending to the throne of Apex Logistics. Richard laughed with his golf buddies, claiming his son was a corporate genius who was about to secure a multi-million-dollar promotion. They were already spending his unearned salary in their minds. They clinked their crystal glasses, celebrating a glorious victory that was never going to happen. They had absolutely no idea that their entire world was currently being targeted by federal agents because of the very son they were praising. While the Cole family wrapped themselves in a blanket of arrogant delusion, I was sitting in the quiet safety of my true home with my daughter. Maya was exhausted. The reality of her husband's physical and financial abuse had shattered her heart. She was sitting on my sofa holding a warm cup of tea when her phone screen lit up. I had powered it back on specifically to monitor Preston's digital footprint. It was a text message from her husband. I picked up the phone and read the message aloud. Preston did not apologize for shoving her against the wall. He did not explain where the missing hundreds of thousands of dollars had gone. Instead, he weaponized his narcissism. He blamed her. He typed that she was weak and ungrateful for abandoning him on the most important day of his entire life. He called her a coward. But then he shifted to pure, arrogant boasting. He wrote that tonight he was meeting the chairman face to face. He bragged that he was going to secure the promotion and fix all their financial problems in one single handshake. He ended the message by stating that when he came home tonight as the new CEO, she would be begging him for forgiveness. I looked at the glowing screen and felt a cold, ruthless calm settle over my mind. I deleted the message permanently. Maya did not need to see his toxic words. She did not need to carry the weight of his manipulation for another second. I handed the phone back to her and told her to get up. I told her we were leaving. I did not take her back to the modest rundown house where she grew up. That house was a beautiful sanctuary where I raised her, but it was also a carefully constructed shield. I drove her into the heart of downtown Atlanta. I pulled into the heavily guarded subterranean parking garage of the most exclusive high-rise tower in the city. The security personnel recognized me immediately and stood at strict attention. Maya looked around in utter confusion. I guided her to a private elevator completely restricted from the public. I placed my thumb on the biometric scanner and the brass doors slid open. We rode in silence all the way to the top floor. When the doors opened, Maya stepped into a sprawling multi-million-dollar penthouse suite overlooking the entire Atlanta skyline. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a commanding view of the city I practically owned. The floors were imported marble. The art on the walls was authentic and priceless. Maya dropped her small duffel bag on the floor and stared at me in absolute shock. She asked me whose house this was. She asked me what we were doing here. I walked over to the massive glass window and looked down at the tiny cars moving on the streets below. I told my daughter the absolute truth. I told her that this was my home. I told her that 40 years ago I did not just work in a warehouse. I told her I bought the warehouse. I told her I built a supply chain empire from the dirt up. I explained that I hid my wealth from her because I wanted her to grow up valuing hard work and character over trust funds and entitlement. I wanted her to be strong. I apologized for deceiving her, but I told her that my deception was the only thing that kept the vultures away until Preston Cole managed to slip through the cracks. Maya walked up beside me and looked out over the city. She did not yell. She did not cry. The betrayal she had suffered at the hands of her husband had hardened her spirit. She looked at me and asked what we were going to do now. I put my arm around her shoulder and told her we were going to amputate the infection. A few hours later, my private tailor arrived at the penthouse. His name was Antonio, and he had been crafting my executive wardrobe for over a decade. I walked into my master dressing room and stripped off the frayed corduroy jacket I had worn to the restaurant. I threw it directly into the trash can. I threw away the scuffed shoes and the faded trousers. The disguise of the frail, broke old man was permanently retired. It had served its purpose perfectly. It had drawn the enemy out into the open and exposed their absolute worst traits. Antonio measured me and brought out a custom $10,000 Brioni suit tailored from the finest dark charcoal wool. The fabric was flawless. I slipped into a crisp white silk shirt and fastened a set of solid platinum cufflinks. I stepped into a pair of handmade Italian leather Oxfords that cost more than Preston's monthly mortgage payment. I stood in front of the full-length mirror and looked at my reflection. The stooped posture was gone. The trembling hands were steady and strong. The hesitant, quiet voice was replaced by a deep, commanding silence. I was no longer Julian, the poor black father-in-law whom Camilla Cole had tried to bribe with a white envelope. I was the apex predator of the corporate food chain. The chairman had finally arrived. I walked back out into the main living area of the penthouse. Maya was sitting on a plush leather sofa watching me. I told her to stay here where it was completely safe. I told her the security detail downstairs had strict orders not to let anyone up and not to let her out until I returned. I promised her that by the time the sun rose tomorrow morning, Preston Cole would be nothing more than a bad memory. I stepped back into the private elevator and descended to the secure garage. My personal driver was standing at attention next to a gleaming, armored black Maybach. The engine was already purring smoothly, filling the concrete structure with a low, powerful hum. The driver opened the heavy rear door for me and nodded respectfully. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty garage. "Where are we heading tonight, sir?" I slid into the luxurious leather back seat and adjusted my platinum cufflinks. The corporate gala was starting. Preston Cole was currently stepping out of a rented limousine, adjusting a rented tuxedo, preparing to shake the hand of the man he thought would save his miserable life. He was marching blindly into the grand ballroom, completely unaware that federal agents were already waiting in the shadows. He was smiling for the cameras, oblivious to the fact that his entire existence was about to be publicly eradicated. I looked at my driver through the rearview mirror. My voice was calm, cold, and absolute. "Take me to the 4 seasons I commanded. It is time to end this." I never told my son-in-law I was the CEO of the multi-billion-dollar company he worked for. To him, I was just Julian Carter, an old, broke black man living on a fixed pension in a rundown house. When he invited me to a fancy dinner with his wealthy white parents, I wanted to see how they would treat a man they thought had nothing. Halfway through the meal, his mother looked at me with pure disgust, slid a white envelope across the table, and told me I was an embarrassment. 2 minutes later, sitting in my old truck, I made a single phone call that would systematically dismantle their perfect, arrogant lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. The heavy armored doors of my Maybach opened smoothly as my driver pulled to a stop in front of the 4 Seasons Hotel. The warm Atlanta night air hit my face as I stepped out onto the pristine pavement. Valets were rushing back and forth, opening doors for regional executives and corporate vice presidents. These were the men and women who worked under the massive umbrella of Carter Holdings. They were all arriving to celebrate the annual gala of Apex Logistics. None of them knew the man stepping out of the black car behind them was the very architect of the empire they served. I walked through the grand revolving doors of the hotel lobby. The transformation was absolute. I was no longer wearing the scuffed shoes and the frayed corduroy jacket that invited the scorn of the elite. I was wearing a custom-tailored Brioni suit spun from dark charcoal wool that cost $10,000. The silk shirt rested perfectly against my skin. My posture was straight. My shoulders were pulled back. I moved with the silent, heavy gravity of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. Real power does not need to shout. It does not need to announce itself. It commands the oxygen in the room simply by existing. I bypassed the crowded registration tables in the main lobby. The event coordinators did not stop me. My security team had already secured my access. I walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the grand ballroom. The sound of clinking crystal glasses and the low hum of hundreds of overlapping conversations grew louder with every step. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom were propped wide open. The space inside was magnificent. Massive chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over the corporate elite of Atlanta. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate appetizers. I paused at the entrance, standing perfectly still in the shadows just outside the light. I scanned the massive room. It took me less than 30 seconds to find my target. Preston Cole was standing near the center of the room. He was holding a flute of champagne and laughing loudly at a joke someone else had just told. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him just a little too tightly around the shoulders. I knew he had rented it that very morning using dirty cash he borrowed from illegal loan sharks. He was sweating slightly under the hot ballroom lights, but he was projecting a desperate, frantic aura of absolute confidence. He was playing the role of the conquering hero. He was acting like a man who was already sitting on the regional CEO throne. Standing right next to him, basking in his unearned glory, were his parents, Richard and Camilla Cole. Richard was wearing a stiff navy suit, holding a drink and patting his son on the back. Camilla was wearing an emerald green dress and a string of pearls. She was leaning in close to a group of older executives' wives, boasting loudly. Even from across the room, I could read her body language. She was bragging. She was telling anyone who would listen that her brilliant son was the golden boy of Apex Logistics. She was telling them that tonight Preston was going to shake hands with the Phantom Chairman and secure the promotion of a lifetime. They looked so incredibly proud. They looked completely untouched by the reality of the situation. They had no idea that Preston had drained his own wife's bank accounts. They had no idea that he had forged my daughter's signature on a massive, fraudulent mortgage. They had no idea that federal agents were already positioned outside the emergency exits of this very building. They were holding court, acting like royalty on the deck of a sinking ship. I took a slow, deep breath. I smoothed the lapels of my dark charcoal suit. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly through the grand oak doors. I did not rush. I walked with a slow, deliberate pace, cutting a path straight down the center of the ballroom. A strange thing happens when a man with absolute authority enters a crowded room. The people who do not even know you subconsciously sense the shift in the atmosphere. Junior executives stepped aside. Waiters paused and lowered their trays to let me pass. The loud conversations near my path quietly faded into curious whispers as I moved deeper into the crowd. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Preston. He was taking a sip of his champagne when he finally turned his head. I saw the exact moment his eyes found me. I saw the physical shock hit his body. His hand jerked, and a splash of expensive champagne spilled over the rim of his glass and stained the cuff of his rented tuxedo shirt. The smug, arrogant smile melted off his face instantly. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He stared at me as if he were looking at a ghost. For a split second, his brain simply could not process what he was seeing. He saw the face of the poor black father-in-law he despised, but the context was entirely wrong. I was not supposed to be here. I was supposed to be hiding in shame. I was supposed to be sitting in a rundown house thousands of miles away, bought and paid for by his mother's $10,000 bribe. The shock quickly mutated into a blinding, irrational rage. The self-preservation instincts of a desperate man took over. Preston slammed his half-empty champagne glass down onto a passing waiter's tray with enough force to shatter the crystal stem. He muttered something aggressive to his parents and marched directly toward me. He moved fast, pushing his way roughly through a group of chatting executives. Richard and Camilla noticed his sudden panic. They turned their heads and saw me standing calmly in the middle of the ballroom. Camilla actually gasped. Her hand flew up to clutch her pearls. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, utter disgust. Richard scowled and quickly followed his son, clearly ready to handle what he believed was a pathetic family embarrassment. Preston closed the distance between us. He stopped less than 2 feet away from me. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his tight, rented jacket. His eyes were wide and manic. He did not notice the flawless stitching of my $10,000 suit. He did not notice the platinum cufflinks catching the light of the chandeliers. His deeply ingrained racism and his overwhelming arrogance completely blinded him to the reality of the situation. All he saw was the old broke black man he had thrown out of his office 2 days ago. All he saw was a threat to his perfect illusion. "What the hell are you doing here?" Preston hissed, keeping his voice low but completely laced with venom. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of alcohol and sheer panic. "I paid you. My mother gave you 10 grand to stay away from this night." I looked at him. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I let the silence hang between us, letting his anxiety boil over. "You are going to ruin everything," Preston spat, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "The chairman is arriving any minute. The entire executive board is in this room. If they see you here looking like this, they will think I am a joke." Camilla arrived at his side. She glared at me as if I were a piece of garbage that had blown in from the street. "Julian, you are completely out of your mind," she whispered harshly. "You took our money. You made a deal. You have absolutely no class coming here and humiliating our son on the most important night of his career. Leave this building right now before you cause a scene." Richard stepped up right next to his wife, puffing out his chest. "Listen to me, you stubborn old fool," Richard threatened in a low growl. "We warned you about this. You are mentally unwell and you are trespassing at a private corporate event. You need to turn around and walk out those doors before I personally have you thrown out onto the pavement." I looked at the three of them, a trinity of absolute arrogance, a family built entirely on lies and unearned entitlement. Preston was trembling with rage, his hands curled into tight fists at his sides. He thought he was currently the most powerful man in my vicinity. He thought he commanded the room. "I am not going anywhere, Preston," I said. My voice was calm, cold, and completely devoid of fear. "I have every right to be in this ballroom tonight." Preston lost the last shred of his composure. His eyes darted around the room, and he spotted a pair of massive private security guards standing near the catering entrance. These were not standard hotel guards. They were elite corporate security dressed in sharp black suits with earpieces discreetly tucked behind their ears. "Security," Preston shouted, raising his hand and waving them over. His voice carried over the nearby crowd, drawing the attention of several high-ranking executives. "Security, get over here right now." The two massive guards immediately began walking toward us. They moved with swift professional purpose, cutting through the crowd effortlessly. "You brought this on yourself, old man," Preston sneered, a wicked, victorious smile spreading across his sweating face. "I warned you never to step foot near my company again. I told you I would have you arrested. I am the regional director of this branch, and I am having you removed from the premises like the trash you are. Watch your back because you are going to spend the night in a holding cell." The two security guards arrived. They were both well over 6 feet tall, heavily muscled, and strictly business. They stopped directly in front of us. Preston pointed a demanding finger right at my face. "This man is trespassing at a private executive event," Preston commanded, speaking to the guards as if they were his personal servants. "He is not on the guest list. He is harassing me and my family. Grab him by the arms, drag him out the back service doors, and throw him out onto the street. If he resists, call the police and press charges." I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still, keeping my eyes locked dead onto Preston's face. The two massive security guards did not reach for my arms. They did not grab my collar. They did not even look at me with suspicion. Instead, they smoothly stepped past Preston, brushing his pointing arm out of the way. They moved directly to my left and my right. They pivoted sharply, turning their backs to me and facing Preston Cole. They crossed their hands in front of them and stood at strict, rigid attention, flanking me like a pair of human shields. They were not there to remove me. They were there to protect me. Preston stopped breathing. His pointing hand slowly fell to his side. The arrogant, victorious smile completely vanished from his face. He stared at the two guards and then he stared at me. His mind was violently crashing, trying to process an equation that made absolutely no logical sense in his twisted, racist worldview. "What are you doing?" Preston stammered, his voice suddenly weak and trembling. "I gave you a direct order. I am the regional director. Remove this man immediately." The lead security guard looked Preston dead in the eyes. His voice was flat and completely authoritative. "I am sorry, sir," the guard stated loudly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear, "but we take our orders directly from the chairman of Carter Holdings, and no one touches Mr. Carter." Preston took a staggering step backward. The color drained out of his entire body. He looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. He looked at my face. He looked at the guards. And in that terrifying silent moment, the crushing weight of the absolute truth finally began to fall. I never told my son-in-law I was the CEO of the multi-billion-dollar company he worked for. To him, I was just Julian Carter, an old broke black man living on a fixed pension in a rundown house. When he invited me to a fancy dinner with his wealthy white parents, I wanted to see how they would treat a man they thought had nothing. Halfway through the meal, his mother looked at me with pure disgust, slid a white envelope across the table, and told me I was an embarrassment. 2 minutes later, sitting in my old truck, I made a single phone call that would systematically dismantle their perfect, arrogant lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. The two massive security guards stood like statues on either side of me. Preston was completely frozen. His brain was misfiring. He looked at the guards, and then he looked at my face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His father, Richard, took a step forward, his face red with anger and confusion. Richard demanded to know what was going on. He told the guards they were making a massive mistake and that his son was the regional director. The guards did not even blink. They did not acknowledge Richard at all. They kept their eyes fixed straight ahead, acting as an impenetrable wall between me and the arrogant family that had tried to destroy my life. Camilla was clutching her pearls so tightly I thought the string would snap. She whispered to Richard, asking why the security team was protecting a crazy old man. They still did not understand. Their deeply ingrained prejudice simply would not allow them to process the reality standing right in front of them. To them, I was still just the pathetic father-in-law who needed to be hidden away in a cheap nursing home. Before Preston could muster enough courage to argue with the security detail, a sudden sharp sound echoed through the grand ballroom. The ambient music abruptly faded into silence. The heavy crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling slowly dimmed, casting the vast space into a dramatic hush. A single bright spotlight illuminated the main stage at the far end of the room. The hundreds of executives, vice presidents, and corporate partners stopped their conversations and turned their attention toward the podium. Preston immediately abandoned his confrontation with me. His corporate survival instincts kicked in. He spun around and faced the stage, his posture instantly stiffening. He frantically smoothed the lapels of his rented tuxedo and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He thought the moment he had been waiting for his entire life had finally arrived. He was preparing to meet the phantom boss. Richard leaned in close to his son and nudged him sharply in the ribs. "Get ready, son," Richard whispered, his voice thick with greedy anticipation. "This is it. Fix your tie. Go stand near the front. When he comes out, you walk right up and shake his hand. Show him you are the man to lead this region." Camilla nodded enthusiastically, stepping closer to Preston. She patted his shoulder and told him to remember everything they had practiced. She told him to be charming and ruthless. They completely dismissed my presence behind them. In their minds, I was just an annoying insect that the security guards would deal with later. They were entirely focused on the empty stage, waiting for a phantom billionaire to emerge from behind the velvet curtains. I stood perfectly still, flanked by my security detail, watching the three of them vibrate with pathetic, eager greed. A man in a sharp navy suit stepped out from the shadows and walked up to the acrylic podium. It was Marcus Vance, my proxy chief executive officer. He looked out over the sea of 500 faces. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Marcus tapped the microphone twice. The sound echoed heavily across the grand ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice projecting absolute authority. "Tonight is a very special night for Apex Logistics and for our entire corporate family. We are gathered here to celebrate another year of unprecedented growth and market dominance. But tonight is not just about the numbers on a spreadsheet. Tonight is about legacy." Preston was practically vibrating with excitement. He took a half step forward, positioning himself perfectly so he would be the first person the chairman saw when he descended from the stage. He was smiling a hungry, desperate smile. For the past 10 years, Marcus continued, his voice echoing through the massive speakers. The founder and sole owner of Carter Holdings has operated entirely in the shadows. He is a man who does not seek the spotlight. He is a man who believes that true power is built on the warehouse floor, not in a corner office. 40 years ago, he started this empire with nothing but a single truck and a rented garage in Detroit. He built a global supply chain through sheer willpower, unbreakable character, and a ruthless dedication to the truth. I watched Richard nod approvingly, whispering to Camilla about how much he respected self-made men. It was laughable. He respected the money, not the struggle. Preston was nodding along, acting as if he deeply understood the core values of the company he was currently embezzling millions of dollars from. But tonight, Marcus said, pausing for dramatic effect, tonight the shadows are lifting. For the first time in a decade, the architect of our empire has chosen to step into the light. He is here in this very room with us right now. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of 500 executives. People began looking around, frantically craning their necks to see if a mysterious billionaire was standing near the VIP tables or emerging from the private suites. Preston stood up taller, puffing out his chest and staring intensely at the velvet curtains behind the podium. He was completely ready to pounce. He was ready to charm the invisible king. Marcus extended his right hand, pointing not toward the VIP doors behind the stage, but directly over the heads of the crowd. He pointed straight toward the back of the grand ballroom. He pointed exactly to where I was standing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, his voice booming with absolute reverence, "please welcome the founder, chairman, and sole owner of Carter Holdings, Mr. Julian Carter." The heavy spotlight at the top of the ballroom whipped across the room, slicing through the darkness. It swept over the heads of the regional directors. It swept over the bewildered faces of the vice presidents. And it landed squarely on me. The brilliant, blinding white light illuminated my custom $10,000 Brioni suit, my platinum cufflinks, and my cold, unblinking face. The entire room of 500 corporate elites turned in unison following the beam of light. For 1 second, there was a silence so profound it felt like the earth had stopped spinning. Then the proxy CEO started clapping. The board of directors at the front tables immediately stood up and joined him. Within 5 seconds, every single person in that massive ballroom was on their feet. A thunderous, deafening standing ovation filled the room, echoing off the marble floors and the crystal chandeliers. They were clapping for me. They were honoring the man who built their world. Preston Cole was standing exactly 2 feet in front of me. When the spotlight hit my face, his entire body went completely rigid. The hungry, eager smile on his face froze and then shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. His eyes widened so far I thought they would burst from his skull. He looked at the stage. He looked at Marcus pointing at me. He looked at the hundreds of executives giving a standing ovation to the man standing directly behind him. The crystal flute of expensive champagne slipped from the trembling fingers of Preston Cole. It hit the solid marble floor with a sharp, violent crash. The glass shattered, sending shards and pale liquid splashing across the polished tips of his rented black shoes. He did not even look down. He could not breathe. He could not move. Camilla Cole stopped breathing entirely. Her mouth dropped open in a silent scream of absolute horror. She stared at me, her eyes tracking the flawless tailoring of my suit and the 2 massive security guards standing at attention by my side. She realized in one crushing, devastating second that the man she had tried to bribe with a cheap white envelope was the absolute master of her son's entire universe. Richard stumbled backward, bumping into a cocktail table, his face turning the color of wet ash. The arrogant country club patriarch looked like he was about to suffer a massive heart attack right there on the ballroom floor. The realization that they had insulted, degraded, and threatened the sole owner of a multi-billion-dollar empire physically broke them. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not say a single word to them. I simply stepped forward. The 2 security guards moved smoothly, clearing a path for me through the dense crowd. I walked with slow, deliberate, heavy steps. I walked right past Richard and Camilla, ignoring their existence completely. I walked right up to Preston Cole. I stopped for a fraction of a second. I looked directly into his wide, terrified, manic eyes. I saw his entire fraudulent life flashing before him. I saw the realization that his stolen money, his fake contracts, and his desperate loans were all completely worthless. He was looking at the executioner. I held his terrified gaze just long enough to let him know that he was already dead. Then I turned my head and continued walking, leaving him choking on his own panic. The crowd parted like the sea as I made my way down the center aisle. The applause thundered in my ears, but I remained perfectly stoic. I climbed the short steps to the main stage. Marcus stepped back, respectfully yielding the podium to me. I walked up to the microphone. I placed my hands on the smooth acrylic edges. I looked out over the vast room of standing executives. Then I looked straight to the back of the room where Preston Cole was standing, frozen in the spotlight, staring up at me like a condemned man waiting for the blade to fall. I leaned into the microphone. It was time to end his entire world. The applause slowly faded into a heavy, absolute silence. 500 of the most powerful executives in the supply chain industry stood before me, holding their breath. I looked out over the sea of tailored suits and expensive evening gowns. The blinding white spotlight beat down on my shoulders, but I did not blink. I rested my hands on the smooth acrylic edges of the podium. I let the silence stretch. I let it weigh down on the room until the tension was a physical, crushing force. I looked straight down the center aisle, my eyes locked onto Preston Cole. He was standing exactly where I had left him, frozen in a puddle of shattered crystal and spilled champagne. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows waiting for the heavy lever to be pulled. I leaned closer to the microphone. My voice resonated through the massive speakers filling every single corner of the grand ballroom. It was deep calm and absolutely lethal. A wise man once told me that money does not change people. I let the words hang in the air, holding the gaze of the entire room. It merely exposes them. I looked slowly across the front rows of the audience, making eye contact with the senior vice presidents and regional directors. I told them about the foundation of Carter Holdings. I told them that 40 years ago I was not wearing a $10,000 custom suit. I was wearing steel-toed work boots. I was lifting heavy boxes in a freezing warehouse in Detroit. I built this global empire on the sweat and dedication of honest working people. I told the room that true leadership is about protecting the people at the bottom of the ladder, not exploiting them to pad a quarterly bonus. I kept my voice perfectly even. I did not scream. I did not raise my tone. The quietest voice in the room is always the one that commands the most terror. I told the crowd that a company is only as strong as its core integrity, and recently I discovered a profound, dangerous infection within our own ranks. I told them I decided to put on a gray janitor's uniform and walk the floors of the Atlanta branch. I told them I wanted to see exactly how our leadership treated the invisible people when they thought the chairman was thousands of miles away. What I found was not just arrogant mismanagement. What I found was a calculated, ruthless betrayal of every single value this company stands for. I raised my right hand and gave a subtle nod to the audio-visual team stationed in the high balcony. The lights in the grand ballroom dimmed completely, plunging the audience into darkness. Behind me, 3 massive high-definition screens illuminated the stage. The glowing white light reflected off the horrified faces of the executives in the front rows. I am a man who believes in absolute transparency, I stated, my voice echoing like thunder over the quiet crowd. So tonight we are going to do a live public audit of the Atlanta branch. The center screen flashed. It displayed a massive, heavily redacted banking ledger. I did not need to shout. I methodically dismantled Preston Cole with the surgical precision of a billionaire who had spent his entire life destroying corporate parasites. I pointed to the screen and explained that the documents behind me were the private internal ledgers of a regional director sitting in this very room. I showed the crowd the exact paper trail of a highly sophisticated corporate embezzlement ring. The left screen flashed. It displayed the incorporation documents of 3 different shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. I read the names of the fake consulting firms out loud. I showed the audience how millions of dollars from our warehouse safety budgets and driver overtime funds were being siphoned off into these phantom corporations. I showed the offshore wire transfers. I showed the hidden routing numbers. The paper trail was absolute flawless and completely damning. A collective gasp erupted from the ballroom. 500 executives began to murmur in shock. They were looking at undeniable federal crimes displayed in high definition at a corporate celebration. I watched Preston from the stage. He was shaking violently. His mouth opened and closed, but he could not pull any oxygen into his lungs. The rented tuxedo looked like a straitjacket suffocating him. He was watching his entire life, his career, his freedom being broadcast to the very people he had desperately tried to impress. The junior executives who had laughed with him in his office were now staring at the screens in utter horror. But corporate theft is only a matter of money. I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that silenced the murmuring crowd immediately. What truly exposes a man is what he does when he thinks no one is watching. What exposes a man is how he treats his own family when he becomes desperate to hide his failures. I signaled the audio-visual team again. The right screen flashed brightly. It displayed a highly magnified image of a residential mortgage application. I told the silent, horrified room that the man who stole millions from my workers was still drowning in hidden debts from illegal loan sharks. I told them that to save his own skin, he went into the home he shared with his loyal wife and committed severe mortgage fraud. I directed their attention to the bottom of the document on the screen. It was a massive digital blow-up of a forged signature. He forged the signature of his own wife to steal the equity out of her home, I declared. He stole the safety and security of the woman who loved him just to cover his criminal margins and maintain his pathetic illusion of wealth. The gasps in the room grew louder. People were physically recoiling. The disgust was spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. But I was not finished. I had one final nail for his coffin. I signaled the tech team one last time. The center screen shifted. It no longer showed accounting spreadsheets or legal loan documents. It displayed a crisp, high-resolution photograph taken by my private investigator. It showed Preston Cole walking into a luxury downtown hotel with a 24-year-old blonde woman hanging on his arm. The next slide showed a scanned receipt from an elite jewelry boutique in the city. The total purchase price was clearly circled in bright red ink, $50,000. He stole the safety budget from hardworking men and women to buy a $50,000 diamond necklace for his mistress, I announced. The words struck the room like a physical shockwave. The disgust radiating from the crowd was palpable and overwhelming. I looked down at the center of the room. The executives who had been standing near Preston were actively stepping away from him. They were creating a wide, empty circle around him, treating him like a highly infectious disease. No one wanted to be associated with a man who was publicly burning to the ground. I looked past Preston to where his parents were standing. Richard and Camilla Cole were completely broken. The arrogant country club elites who had sat in a fancy French restaurant and handed me a $10,000 bribe were now shrinking into the shadows. Camilla had both hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She was trying to back away, to melt into the crowd, to hide from the absolute ultimate humiliation of her entire bloodline. Richard was staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped, his pristine navy suit looking like a costume on a defeated coward. They were experiencing the exact shame and degradation they had tried to force onto me. Their social standing, their country club bragging, their entire arrogant identity was obliterated in less than 5 minutes. Preston was left completely alone in the center of the empty circle. The bright spotlight from the stage caught the sweat pouring down his pale face. He was hyperventilating. His eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for an exit, looking for a friend, looking for anyone who would step forward and save him. But there was no one. He was entirely trapped in a public nightmare of his own making. He took a shaky, pathetic step forward toward the stage. His legs looked like they could barely support his weight. He raised his hands in a begging, pleading gesture. He looked up at me standing behind the podium. He had completely forgotten the 500 powerful people watching his every move. He had forgotten his arrogance. He had forgotten his overwhelming pride. All that was left was the terrifying reality of a broken man looking at decades in a federal penitentiary. Dad Preston stammered, his voice cracking, echoing weakly and pathetically in the massive, silent ballroom. "Julian, please, you have to listen to me. This is all a huge misunderstanding. I can explain everything. Please, Dad." The audacity to use that word. The sheer pathetic desperation to invoke a familial bond he had mocked, exploited, and destroyed. I looked down at him from the podium. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt the cold, satisfying closure of a perfectly executed strategy. I felt the profound justice for my daughter Maya. I felt the absolute protection of my empire. I leaned forward, resting my elbows heavily on the acrylic podium. I brought my mouth directly to the microphone. I looked straight into his terrified, manic eyes, ensuring that my final words would be burned into his memory for the rest of his miserable life. "I am not your dad," I said, my voice echoing with final, undeniable, absolute authority. "I am your boss, and you are fired." I never told my son-in-law I was the CEO of the multi-billion-dollar company he worked for. To him, I was just Julian Carter, an old, broke black man living on a fixed pension in a rundown house. When he invited me to a fancy dinner with his wealthy white parents, I wanted to see how they would treat a man they thought had nothing. Halfway through the meal, his mother looked at me with pure disgust, slid a white envelope across the table, and told me I was an embarrassment. 2 minutes later, sitting in my old truck, I made a single phone call that would systematically dismantle their perfect, arrogant lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I am your boss, and you are fired. The echo of my voice faded into the vast expanse of the grand ballroom, but the impact of those words continued to roll through the crowd like a shockwave. 500 of the most powerful executives in the supply chain industry stood in absolute stunned silence. Preston stood frozen in the center of the room. The reality of his situation was finally penetrating his thick, arrogant skull. He was not going to be the regional chief executive officer. He was not going to shake hands with a phantom billionaire and secure a golden parachute to cover his hidden debts. He was looking at the man whose daughter he had abused, whose money he had stolen, and whose company he had betrayed. I watched the exact moment his fight or flight instinct hijacked his nervous system. His chest heaved as he gasped for oxygen that his lungs simply refused to process. His eyes darted wildly from the massive screens displaying his federal crimes to the hundreds of executives staring at him with absolute revulsion. He looked at his father, Richard, who was paralyzed with shame. He looked at his mother, Camilla, who was weeping into her hands. There was no one left to save him. The illegal loan sharks were waiting for him in the shadows of the city. The corporate world had just permanently exiled him. He had absolutely nothing left. Preston turned his back on the stage. He did not say another word. He did not try to offer another pathetic apology. He lowered his head and pushed his way through the circle of executives that had formed around him. He was shoving people aside, stepping on expensive evening gowns and tailored trousers. He was running. He was a coward, retreating from the consequences of his own monstrous arrogance. He moved frantically toward the back of the ballroom, his eyes locked on the glowing red emergency exit sign above the heavy brass doors. He thought he could just walk away. He thought he could escape into the warm Atlanta night and figure out a way to spin this disaster. He was completely oblivious to the fact that I had already sealed every single exit. I stood silently behind the acrylic podium and watched him run. I did not signal my security detail to stop him. I let him make his desperate sprint across the marble floor. I wanted him to feel that fleeting, deceptive spark of hope. I wanted him to believe for just 5 more seconds that he could outrun the executioner. Preston reached the back of the room. He threw his body weight against the heavy brass crash bar of the emergency exit. But before the metal hinges could even disengage, the heavy double doors violently burst open from the outside. The force of the doors swinging inward threw Preston backward. He stumbled, trying to catch his balance in his rented shoes. Stepping through the threshold into the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers were 4 men. They were not hotel security. They were not local police officers. They were wearing dark tactical pants and navy blue windbreakers. Across the chest and back of their jackets were 3 large, bright yellow letters. FBI. Special Agent Vance led the formation. He moved with the swift, terrifying precision of a predator locking onto its prey. Preston let out a high-pitched sound of pure terror. He tried to spin around and run back into the crowd, but his legs betrayed him. He had nowhere to go. Agent Vance lunged forward. He grabbed Preston by the shoulder of his rented tuxedo jacket and spun him around with incredible force. Preston collided hard with the polished marble wall near the exit. The impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. A framed painting rattled against the wall. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. Preston Cole, Agent Vance, announced, his voice carrying a booming, authoritative weight that cut through the murmurs of the corporate elite. You are under arrest for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. One of the other agents grabbed Preston by his wrists and twisted them roughly behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tight echoed through the silent room. It was the sound of a life ending. It was the sound of arrogance being locked inside a cage. Preston was sobbing now. Real, pathetic tears streamed down his pale face. He pushed his cheek against the cold marble wall, whimpering as the federal agents patted him down and confiscated his wallet and his phone. The crowd of executives could no longer contain their shock. Hundreds of cell phones were suddenly raised into the air. The bright flashes of phone cameras illuminated the back of the room like a lightning storm. They were recording every single second of his downfall. The golden boy of Apex Logistics, the man who had fired veteran warehouse managers just 2 days ago to pad his bonus, was currently being frisked by federal agents in front of his entire professional network. His career, his reputation, his freedom, and his carefully constructed elitist identity were being permanently annihilated in real time. The footage would be on every corporate news site by morning. He would never work in this industry again. He would be lucky if he saw the outside of a federal penitentiary in the next 15 years. Agent Vance read him his Miranda rights. The words were a relentless hammer striking the final nails into his coffin. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. From the center of the room, a piercing, hysterical scream shattered the atmosphere. It was Camilla Cole. Her country club facade had completely disintegrated. Her perfect emerald green dress looked rumpled. Her heavy pearl necklace bounced wildly against her chest as she shoved her way through the crowd of stunned executives. She was running toward the stage. She was running toward me. The two massive security guards flanking my position immediately stepped forward to intercept her. They raised their hands, ready to physically block her from reaching the podium. But I raised my right hand. I gave them a subtle command to stand down. They hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping back and clearing the path. I wanted her to approach. I wanted to look her directly in the eyes. Camilla reached the edge of the stage and collapsed against the polished wood. She was weeping hysterically. The heavy, expensive makeup she had carefully applied to impress the phantom chairman was now running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She looked up at me. Her eyes were wide and filled with a frantic, begging terror. The same woman who had looked at my worn corduroy jacket with absolute disgust was now looking at me as if I were a god who held the power of life and death. "Please, Mr. Carter," she wailed, her voice cracking under the weight of her despair. "Please, I am begging you. He is our only son. He made a mistake. He was just confused and desperate. Please do not let them take him away." Richard Cole had followed his wife to the front of the room, but he did not speak. He stood a few feet behind her, trembling, his head bowed in ultimate defeat. The man who had threatened to throw me into a mental institution was now completely broken, stripped of his false authority, and paralyzed by the magnitude of my power. Camilla reached out her hands, resting them on the edge of the stage. "We will pay you back every single penny," she sobbed loudly enough for the front rows to hear. "We will sell our house. We will empty our retirement accounts. We will do whatever it takes. Just please call them off. Tell the agents it was a misunderstanding. You have the power to stop this. Please show us some mercy." I looked down at her. I looked at the tears streaming down her face. I remembered the way she had sat in that fancy French restaurant. I remembered the cold, patronizing tone she used when she told me I was a burden to my daughter. I remembered how she had offered me a bribe to disappear so I would not stain her precious family image. And most importantly, I remembered the dark purple bruises forming on my daughter's arm because of the monster she had raised. Mercy is a privilege reserved for those who show remorse before they are caught. I did not feel a single drop of pity for the weeping woman at my feet. I felt only the cold, satisfying finality of absolute justice. I stepped out from behind the acrylic podium. I walked to the very edge of the stage, standing directly above her. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see what the billionaire chairman would do. I reached my right hand into the inside breast pocket of my custom-tailored $10,000 suit jacket. I let my fingers brush against the smooth paper hidden inside. I slowly pulled my hand out. Between my index and middle fingers I held a crisp white envelope. It was the exact same envelope Camilla Cole had slid across the restaurant table just a few days ago. The envelope she had used to try and buy my dignity. The envelope containing $10,000 in cash. I looked down into her tear-filled eyes. I held her gaze with a freezing, terrifying calm. I extended my arm over the edge of the stage and slowly opened my fingers. The white envelope slipped from my grasp. It fluttered through the air and landed softly on the marble floor right at her feet. I leaned forward, looking down at the woman who had tried to erase my existence. My voice was low, quiet, and utterly devastating. "Here is $10,000, I said, ensuring that every syllable carved its way into her memory. Use it for his bail. I never told my son-in-law I was the CEO of the multi-billion-dollar company he worked for. To him, I was just Julian Carter, an old, broke black man living on a fixed pension in a rundown house. When he invited me to a fancy dinner with his wealthy white parents, I wanted to see how they would treat a man they thought had nothing. Halfway through the meal, his mother looked at me with pure disgust, slid a white envelope across the table, and told me I was an embarrassment. 2 minutes later, sitting in my old truck, I made a single phone call that would systematically dismantle their perfect, arrogant lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. The morning sun rose over the Atlanta skyline, casting a bright, revealing light on a city that had just witnessed a corporate slaughter. I sat in the plush leather chair of my penthouse drinking a hot cup of black coffee. I turned on the television and flipped through the local news channels. It was a beautiful sight to behold. The terrified face of Preston Cole was plastered across every single morning broadcast and the front page of every major financial newspaper in the state. The headlines read exactly how I had orchestrated them to read. The golden boy of Apex Logistics arrested in massive multi-million-dollar fraud ring. The news anchors enthusiastically detailed the late-night arraignment. They showed sketch artist drawings of Preston standing before a federal judge wearing a bright Orange County jail jumpsuit. His designer tuxedo was gone. His arrogant, smug smirk was entirely erased from his face. The federal judge had looked down at the mountain of undeniable evidence my legal team had handed over to the authorities. The judge saw the fake consulting contracts, the forged signatures, and the offshore routing numbers. But more importantly, the judge saw the predatory loans Preston had taken out from violent underground crime syndicates. The prosecution argued vehemently that Preston was desperate. They argued he had a forged passport and access to hidden foreign accounts, making him an extreme danger to flee the country. The judge did not hesitate for a single second. Bail was completely and unequivocally denied. Preston Cole was declared a massive flight risk. He was remanded immediately to a cold concrete cell without a single sliver of hope. He was locked inside a cage where his fake corporate titles and his racist arrogance meant absolutely nothing. While Preston was sitting on a hard metal bench shivering in a federal holding facility, his parents were waking up to their own personal nightmare. Richard and Camilla Cole thought they could just walk away from the gala and hide in their massive suburban mansion. They thought they could pretend their son's very public arrest was just a terrible misunderstanding. They truly believed they could call their expensive country club lawyers and make the entire problem disappear with a few angry phone calls and a checkbook. They were completely wrong. My forensic accountants had spent the entire night tracing the flow of the embezzled corporate money. We quickly discovered that Preston had not just been buying $50,000 diamond necklaces for his young mistress. He had also been funneling stolen corporate funds directly into his parents' personal bank accounts to help them maintain their pathetic illusion of high society wealth. The massive mansion they lived in and the luxury cars they drove were heavily financed by money stolen from my hardworking warehouse employees. I made absolutely sure the federal authorities knew exactly where that dirty money went. At exactly 8 in the morning, a fleet of black sport utility vehicles pulled into the quiet, tree-lined streets of their exclusive upscale neighborhood. Neighbors were stepping out onto their manicured lawns, holding their morning coffee cups, watching in absolute shock. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers swarmed the property of Richard and Camilla Cole. They did not knock politely and wait for an invitation. They breached the heavy wooden front doors with a heavy battering ram. The agents flooded the house, executing a massive federal asset seizure warrant. They were there to reclaim every single penny that rightfully belonged to Carter Holdings. I received a highly detailed report from my private investigator who was parked down the street watching the entire glorious scene unfold. He told me Camilla was dragged out onto her front lawn wearing her expensive silk pajamas, screaming and crying hysterically. She begged the federal agents to stop carrying out her expensive artwork and her designer furniture. Richard was frantically shouting into his cell phone, trying to hire a high-powered defense attorney, but his calls kept ending in failure. Every single bank account tied to his name had been frozen by the federal government. He had absolutely no money to pay a legal retainer. He was completely and utterly broke. Then the heavy tow trucks arrived. The massive diesel engines roared through the quiet, wealthy neighborhood, disrupting the peaceful morning. The operators backed up their trucks and hooked heavy steel chains to the axles of Richard and Camilla's luxury vehicles. They dragged the gleaming silver Mercedes and the custom black BMW right down the driveway. The loud, grinding noise echoed down the street for all their snobby country club neighbors to hear. The very people they had spent years trying to impress, the people they had bragged to about their brilliant son, were now standing on the sidewalks, whispering and pointing fingers at them. Camilla collapsed onto the wet grass, hiding her face in her hands, completely humiliated and utterly destroyed. Her entire identity was tied to her wealth and her status, and both had just been vaporized in front of her friends. They were left standing on the sidewalk with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. The arrogant family that had looked at my worn corduroy jacket with disgust, the family that had tried to buy my dignity with a $10,000 bribe, was now effectively homeless and destitute. While the Cole family was being aggressively eradicated from high society, my daughter Maya was finally taking her life back. The fear and the sorrow that had paralyzed her the day before were completely gone. The truth has a wonderful way of burning away the thick fog of emotional manipulation. She woke up in my penthouse clear-headed and resolute. She did not shed a single tear for the man who had bruised her arm and stolen her savings. She asked me to drive her to the federal detention center. She had one final piece of business to handle before she could move on. I drove my armored Maybach to the bleak gray building of the federal holding facility. I parked in the visitor lot and turned off the engine. I told Maya I would go inside with her if she wanted me to, but she shook her head. She told me this was something she had to do completely alone. I watched my beautiful, strong daughter walk through the heavy glass doors of the prison with her head held high. Maya later told me exactly what happened inside that cold, stark visitor room. She sat down in a hard plastic chair and waited behind a thick wall of reinforced glass. A guard brought Preston into the room. He looked terrible. His hair was greasy and unkempt. His skin was pale and his eyes were bloodshot and wide with absolute panic. He picked up the heavy black telephone receiver on his side of the glass. Maya calmly picked up her receiver. Preston immediately started begging. He cried real pathetic tears, pressing his face against the glass. He told Maya he was incredibly sorry. He blamed his parents for putting too much pressure on him to succeed. He blamed the cutthroat corporate culture at Apex Logistics for forcing him to make bad decisions. He told her he only stole the money to build a better life for their family. He conveniently failed to mention the 24-year-old blonde mistress. He completely failed to mention the $50,000 diamond necklace. He begged Maya to talk to me. He pleaded with her to ask her billionaire father to drop the federal charges and hire him a good lawyer. He was a desperate parasite clinging to the very last drop of blood he could find. Maya did not yell at him. She did not curse his name or bang her fists on the glass. She did not even give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She looked at the pathetic, broken man sitting in a wrinkled orange jumpsuit and felt absolutely nothing. The love she once had for him was entirely dead. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. It was not an envelope filled with bribe money. It was an envelope filled with legal documents. She slid the heavy stack of papers through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the glass partition. Preston looked down at the papers. His trembling hands hesitated before picking them up. He read the bold black letters printed on the very first page. They were expedited divorce papers declaring a total and complete separation of assets and liabilities based on severe criminal fraud and physical abuse. Maya looked him dead in the eyes. She spoke her final words to him in a calm, steady voice. She told him he was a coward and that he would never see her face again. She hung up the black telephone receiver right in the middle of his frantic, sobbing pleas. She stood up from the plastic chair, turned her back on him, and walked toward the heavy steel exit doors. She ignored him as he banged his fists against the reinforced glass. She did not look back even once. She was finally and completely free. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, watching the main entrance of the detention center. The heavy doors swung open and Maya walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight. I watched the way she moved. Her posture was completely different. The heavy, crushing weight of Preston's toxic manipulation was entirely gone from her shoulders. She walked with a fierce, confident stride that reminded me so much of her late mother, Vivian. She reached the car and opened the heavy armored door. She climbed into the passenger seat and closed the door, shutting out the loud noise of the city. The cabin of the Maybach was quiet and safe. I looked at my daughter. She turned her head and looked directly at me. She did not see a frail old man who needed to be protected from the world. She did not see a retired warehouse worker struggling to get by. She saw the architect of an empire. She saw the man who had burned an entire arrogant family to the ground to keep her safe. Maya took a deep breath and let it out slowly. A small, determined smile touched the corners of her mouth. She looked me in the eyes and spoke the words that would begin an entirely new era for our family. "Teach me the business, Dad," she said. "I never told my son-in-law I was the CEO of the multi-billion-dollar company he worked for. To him, I was just Julian Carter, an old broke black man living on a fixed pension in a rundown house. When he invited me to a fancy dinner with his wealthy white parents, I wanted to see how they would treat a man they thought had nothing. Halfway through the meal, his mother looked at me with pure disgust, slid a white envelope across the table, and told me I was an embarrassment. 2 minutes later, sitting in my old truck, I made a single phone call that would systematically dismantle their perfect, arrogant lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. 6 months had passed since the night of the corporate gala. The loud, chaotic dust had finally settled over the city of Atlanta, but the landscape of my massive empire was permanently altered. I stood on the high steel catwalk overlooking the central distribution warehouse of Carter Holdings. The deafening roar of mechanical conveyor belts and the heavy, powerful hum of diesel transport engines filled the vast concrete space below me. I rested my hands on the cold metal railing and looked down at the busy loading docks. I watched a young black woman wearing a bright yellow high-visibility vest and heavy steel-toed boots. She was lifting heavy wooden crates and securing them onto a shipping pallet. It was my daughter Maya. She was covered in sweat and her hands were rough and calloused from brutal physical labor. When she asked me to teach her the business on the day she handed Preston his divorce papers, she meant every single word she said. I had offered her a beautiful corner office on the top executive floor of my high-rise building. I had offered her a prestigious vice president title and a massive starting salary. She looked me dead in the eyes and completely refused the offer. She told me she did not want to be a spoiled, oblivious heiress who inherited a complex empire she did not truly understand. She told me she wanted to learn the exact same way I did 40 years ago. She wanted to start at the absolute bottom of the food chain. She wanted to earn the genuine respect of the blue-collar workers, not simply demand it through a corporate title. For the past 6 months, she worked grueling 12-hour shifts, loading commercial trucks, checking massive inventory logs, and managing complex dispatch manifests. She ate her lunch in the noisy break room with the drivers and the loaders. She was forging a suit of armor made of pure, unbreakable steel. She was transforming into a fierce leader who could never be manipulated or used by anyone ever again. While Maya was building her bright, powerful future, Preston Cole was watching his entire world completely disintegrate. The federal government does not offer any mercy to arrogant men who steal millions of corporate dollars and commit severe mortgage fraud. Preston tried to fight the federal charges at first. He genuinely thought he could charm his way out of a massive federal indictment just like he charmed his way into elite country clubs. But his personal accounts were entirely frozen, and his stolen assets were completely seized by the government. He could not afford to hire a high-powered luxury defense attorney. He was assigned a vastly overworked public defender who took one single look at the mountain of undeniable digital evidence my security team had handed over to the authorities. The public defender told Preston directly that he was completely and utterly doomed. Preston was absolutely terrified of facing a public jury trial. He knew with absolute certainty that if he took his case to a jury of working-class people, they would lock him away for 30 years without a second thought. So the arrogant golden boy who thought he was completely invincible swallowed his pathetic pride and begged the prosecutors for a plea deal. He stood in a cold federal courtroom wearing a wrinkled bright orange jumpsuit and publicly confessed to every single financial crime he had committed. The federal judge looked down at him and did not show a single ounce of pity. Preston Cole was formally sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There was absolutely no chance for early release. There was no possibility of parole. He was locked inside a bleak concrete cage surrounded by violent, dangerous men who did not care at all about his fake corporate titles or his tailored luxury suits. His entire arrogant existence was reduced to a miserable, highly regulated daily routine behind thick, heavy steel bars. The resulting fallout for his wealthy parents was equally devastating and incredibly satisfying to watch. Richard and Camilla Cole had spent their entire pathetic lives looking down on hardworking, working-class people. They had mercilessly mocked the poor and flaunted their unearned, stolen wealth at exclusive suburban country clubs. The universe has a beautiful way of delivering absolute, poetic karmic justice. When the federal agents seized their massive mansion and their fleet of luxury cars to cover the stolen corporate funds, Richard and Camilla were left completely and utterly bankrupt. Their wealthy, snobby country club friends abandoned them overnight. No one in their elite social circle would even answer their desperate phone calls. They became immediate social pariahs, permanently exiled from the high society elite circles they so desperately clung to. With absolutely zero financial savings and their credit scores completely destroyed, they were violently forced out of their comfortable reality. They had to move into a cramped, moldy, one-bedroom apartment in the most dangerous, violent neighborhood on the south side of the city. It was the exact kind of impoverished, rundown area they used to drive past and mock from the safety of their luxury vehicles. To survive their new, brutal reality, they had to do something they had aggressively avoided their entire lives. They had to get entry-level minimum wage jobs. Camilla, the arrogant woman who wore heavy pearls and looked at my frayed corduroy jacket with pure, unadulterated disgust, was now wearing a cheap, scratchy polyester uniform. She was forced to work the front cash register at a terrible discount retail store. She stood on her swollen, aching feet for 8 hours a day dealing with rude, angry customers who treated her like absolute garbage. Richard, the arrogant man who threatened to throw me into a mental institution, was now sweeping dirty floors and stocking heavy cardboard boxes on the grueling night shift at a local rundown grocery store. Their arrogant elitist pride was completely shattered and broken down by the crushing, relentless weight of extreme poverty. But minimum wage poverty was not their ultimate horrific punishment. The true horror of their new reality came directly from the very mess their beloved criminal son had created. Preston did not just owe money to traditional banks. He owed massive sums of dirty cash to highly violent underground loan sharks. Those dangerous men did not care that Preston was currently locked inside a federal prison cell. They wanted their money back with extreme interest, and they knew exactly where to find his vulnerable parents. The aggressive harassment began slowly, but it escalated with terrifying speed. Richard and Camilla started receiving anonymous, threatening phone calls in the middle of the night. Dark, unmarked vehicles with tinted windows would idle outside their moldy apartment building for hours, just watching them. Heavy, aggressive knocking would violently shake their flimsy front door at 2 a.m. Large men in dark jackets would follow Camilla closely as she walked home from her terrible retail job, whispering graphic threats about broken legs and violent physical consequences if the family debts were not settled immediately. Richard and Camilla Cole were forced to live every single second of their miserable lives in a state of constant, paralyzing fear. They jumped at every single shadow on the street. They flinched at every loud noise in their building. They could not sleep through the night. They could not even breathe without wondering if today was the terrible day the loan sharks would finally decide to collect their debt in blood. It was a terrifying, inescapable waking nightmare, and there was absolutely no one coming to save them. They were paying the ultimate horrific price for raising, enabling, and encouraging an absolute monster. I stepped away from the cold metal railing of the steel catwalk and walked slowly back toward the private executive elevator. The massive warehouse below me was operating flawlessly. My global supply chain company was stronger and more profitable than it had ever been in its history. The greedy parasites had been completely eradicated from the system, and the structural bloodline of my empire was entirely pure once again. I took the private elevator all the way up to the quiet executive penthouse level. I walked into my massive corner office and sat down heavily behind my large, custom mahogany desk. For 10 long years I had ruled this vast global empire from the quiet, comfortable safety of the shadows. I had let proxy executives take the bright public spotlight while I pulled all the heavy strings in absolute secret. But the shadows were no longer necessary. The brutal corporate war with Preston Cole had taught me a very valuable lesson. Stepping fully into the blinding light was the only way to truly secure and protect my lasting legacy. Marcus Vance, my highly loyal proxy chief executive officer, was officially stepping down to take a senior advisory role within the board of directors. I was publicly reclaiming my rightful title as the active visible chairman and chief executive officer of Carter Holdings. I was taking the steering wheel firmly back into my own hands, but I was not doing it alone. I was bringing my daughter Maya up to the top with me. I looked out at the vast, sprawling Atlanta skyline spread out before me through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Maya was currently down there on the dirty warehouse floor, learning the true heavy weight of real leadership. She was learning exactly how to command a massive corporate empire without ever losing her soul or her compassion. She was no longer the trusting, naive young girl who could be blinded by a slick, confident smile and a rented, tailored suit. She had walked directly through the blazing fire and emerged completely unbreakable. I smiled a deep, profoundly satisfying smile. I was actively grooming the absolute next queen of the corporate world, and I knew with absolute flawless certainty that no man alive would ever underestimate a Carter ever again. I never told my son-in-law I was the CEO of the multi-billion-dollar company he worked for. To him, I was just Julian Carter, an old, broke black man living on a fixed pension in a rundown house. When he invited me to a fancy dinner with his wealthy white parents, I wanted to see how they would treat a man they thought had nothing. Halfway through the meal, his mother looked at me with pure disgust, slid a white envelope across the table, and told me I was an embarrassment. 2 minutes later, sitting in my old truck, I made a single phone call that would systematically dismantle their perfect, arrogant lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. The heavy, armored Maybach glided smoothly along the desolate stretch of highway leading away from the gleaming Atlanta skyline. I sat in the spacious rear cabin watching the scenery change from towering glass corporate monuments to flat barren fields of dry grass and chain-link fences. I was heading toward the federal penitentiary. It had been exactly 1 year since the night of the corporate gala. 1 year since the blinding white spotlight exposed the massive fraud and absolute arrogance of Preston Cole. I had spent the last 12 months actively rebuilding the structural integrity of my empire and guiding my daughter Maya as she forged her own powerful legacy on the warehouse floor. The company was thriving. My family was safe. But there was one final loose end that required my personal attention. One final chapter that needed to be permanently closed. The massive concrete walls of the maximum security facility loomed in the distance. It was a bleak, imposing fortress designed to strip men of their pride and lock them away from the civilized world. My driver pulled the vehicle up to the heavy steel security gates. I stepped out into the harsh, midday sun wearing a custom-tailored dark charcoal suit. The armed perimeter guards checked my identification and cleared me for a special high-security private visitation. I walked through the endless series of heavy metal doors and electronic checkpoints. The air inside the prison was cold and stale. It smelled of bleach and absolute despair. It was the exact opposite of the luxurious velvet-lined country clubs and high-end French restaurants where Preston and his elitist parents used to mock hard-working people. A senior corrections officer escorted me into a small, windowless visiting room. The walls were painted a dull, depressing gray. There was a single metal table bolted directly to the concrete floor and 2 uncomfortable steel chairs facing each other. I sat down in the chair facing the heavy, reinforced steel door. I placed my hands flat on the cold metal table and waited in absolute silence. I did not feel angry. I did not feel any lingering traces of the burning rage that had consumed me when I saw the dark bruises on my daughter's arm. I felt only the chilling calm of a man who is about to observe the final consequences of absolute arrogance. The heavy steel door on the opposite side of the room clicked loudly. The heavy deadbolts disengaged with a harsh mechanical grinding noise. A prison guard stepped into the room holding a thick metal chain. Attached to the end of that chain was Preston Cole. The sight of him was genuinely shocking. The federal penal system does not care about regional director titles or fake consulting firms. It crushes the weak and it breaks the arrogant. Preston had aged 20 years in a single 12-month period. He was wearing a shapeless, bright orange jumpsuit that hung loosely off his drastically thinned frame. He had lost a massive amount of weight. His previously styled hair was thinning and heavily streaked with dull gray. His skin was pale and drawn tight over his cheekbones, making his eyes look sunken and hollow. His wrists and ankles were bound in heavy steel shackles. He shuffled forward, his feet dragging across the concrete floor. The confident, arrogant posture of the man who used to wear expensive silk ties and order people around like garbage was completely eradicated. He looked like a beaten, broken animal. The guard guided Preston to the steel chair across from me. Preston sat down heavily and the guard locked his waist chain directly to a heavy metal ring on the table. The guard stepped back and stood silently in the corner of the room. Preston did not look up immediately. He stared down at his shackled hands resting on the table. His fingers were trembling violently. He took a ragged, shaking breath and finally raised his head to look at me. When his sunken, hollow eyes met my cold, unblinking gaze, I saw the absolute, profound terror radiating from his soul. He was looking at the man who had effortlessly dismantled his entire universe in less than 5 minutes. He was looking at the architect of his permanent destruction. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I let him sit in it. I let him feel the crushing weight of my presence. "Julian," he whispered. His voice was a raspy, broken croak. It sounded like he had not used it in weeks. "Thank you for coming." "I did not think you would ever agree to see me." I did not respond. I simply kept my eyes locked onto his face, waiting for him to dig his own grave just a little bit deeper. "I am so sorry," Preston sobbed. The tears immediately welled up in his eyes and spilled over his pale, sunken cheeks. He leaned forward, straining against his heavy metal chains. "I am so incredibly sorry for everything I did. Every single night in this concrete cell, I lie awake and I think about how much I ruined. I think about Maya. I think about how I lost the best thing that ever happened to me. I watched him perform his pathetic routine. He was still trying to manipulate the narrative. He was trying to play the role of the tragic, remorseful husband. But I knew the truth. I knew he was only crying because he got caught. I knew he was only sorry because he was sitting in a cage surrounded by violent men while his loan sharks actively hunted his destitute parents on the outside. I was stupid, Julian," he pleaded, his voice rising in desperate panic. "I was so incredibly stupid and blind. I just wanted to fit in with the executives at the top. I saw the power you had. I saw the wealth of the board members. I just wanted to be rich like you. I wanted to be someone important. I thought if I could just secure that promotion, I could fix all the hidden debts and give Maya the perfect life. I lost my way, Julian. Please, you have to believe me." I listened to his pathetic excuses. I listened to him try to justify the fact that he stole millions of dollars from hardworking warehouse employees to buy a $50,000 diamond necklace for a 24-year-old mistress. I listened to him try to justify the fact that he shoved my beautiful, innocent daughter against a wall and forged her signature to steal the equity from her home. He was a narcissist right down to his very core. Even in a federal prison uniform, he was still trying to blame his environment for his own monstrous decisions. I slowly leaned forward. I rested my forearms on the cold metal table, bringing my face just inches from his weeping, pathetic eyes. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in a low, deep whisper that cut straight through his sobbing like a razor-sharp blade. "You wanted to be rich," I stated coldly. "I wanted to build a legacy." Preston stopped crying for a fraction of a second. He stared at me, his breath hitching in his chest. "You looked at me, and you saw a poor, uneducated man." I continued my words, striking him with lethal precision. "You saw my skin color, you saw my frayed corduroy jacket, you saw my old beat-up truck. And because of your profound, blinding arrogance, you thought I was weak. You thought I was an easy target. You thought I was a pathetic old fool that you could easily manipulate and throw away whenever you wanted." Preston shook his head frantically, rattling his heavy steel chains. "No, Julian, please. I never meant to disrespect you." "You forgot the most fundamental rule of the wild, Preston," I said, talking right over his desperate whining. I held his gaze, refusing to let him look away from the absolute truth. "You forgot that wolves do not need to bark to prove they have teeth." The words landed with a heavy, devastating finality. Preston realized in that exact moment that there was absolutely no mercy to be found in this room. There was no secret corporate buyout coming to save him. There was no high-priced legal team working in the shadows to secure an early release. He was going to sit in this cold concrete box for the next 15 years of his miserable life. The billionaire chairman sitting across from him was not a forgiving father figure. He was the apex predator who had quietly lured him into the slaughterhouse and locked the doors. "I am going to die in here," Julian Preston wept, hiding his face in his shackled hands. "The people I owe money to on the outside have connections in here. They know where I am. They are making my life a living nightmare. I am begging you. You have the power to move me to a safer facility. You have the power to pay them off. Please show me some mercy." I looked at the broken, weeping man. I thought about my late wife, Vivian. I thought about the promise I made to protect our daughter from the exact kind of monster sitting in front of me. I had fulfilled my promise. The threat was completely neutralized. The infection was entirely amputated from our lives. I placed my hands on the metal table and slowly pushed myself up from the chair. I stood tall, smoothing the lapels of my dark charcoal suit. I looked down at Preston Cole for the very last time. "Enjoy your promotion, Preston," I said quietly. I turned my back on him. I did not wait for the guard to escort me. I walked straight toward the heavy reinforced steel door. Preston began wailing behind me. He screamed my name, begging me to come back, begging me not to leave him alone in the dark. The sound of his desperate crying echoed violently off the cold, gray concrete walls of the visiting room. It was the sound of a completely broken man facing the permanent, horrific consequences of his own boundless greed. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the sound of his weeping instantly. The sharp mechanical click of the deadbolt locking into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. The chapter on Preston Cole was permanently and unequivocally closed. He was erased from our history forever. I walked down the long, silent corridors of the federal penitentiary. The guards opened the security gates and I stepped out through the main entrance. The bright, warm Atlanta sunlight washed over my face. The air outside the prison walls tasted clean and fresh. I walked across the pavement toward my waiting armored car. My driver opened the heavy rear door for me. I slid into the comfortable leather seat and instructed him to drive me to the central distribution warehouse. I had a massive global empire to run, and I had a brilliant, fiercely determined daughter waiting for me on the warehouse floor ready to take on the world. The morning sun crested over the quiet working-class neighborhood, painting the sky in rich shades of deep orange and gold. I sat in a sturdy wooden rocking chair on the front porch of my modest rundown house. This was the exact same house where my late wife Vivian and I had raised our beautiful daughter. I never sold it. I never moved into a sprawling suburban mansion or an exclusive gated community because this simple house kept me entirely grounded. It reminded me every single day of the sacrifices I made and the brutal, freezing Detroit winters I endured to build my massive empire. I held a warm ceramic mug of strong black coffee in my hands, letting the steam rise into the cool morning air. The neighborhood was waking up slowly around me. I watched hardworking people stepping out of their front doors, starting their cars, and heading off to earn an honest living. They were the absolute backbone of this country. They were the very people that arrogant men like Preston Cole and his elitist parents constantly looked down upon with pure, unadulterated disgust. I took a slow, deep sip of my coffee and reflected on the absolute chaos of the past 12 months. Some people might look at the smoldering wreckage of the Cole family and think that I was a cruel, vindictive man. They might think that I ruthlessly destroyed a young, ambitious executive and condemned his wealthy parents to a miserable life of minimum-wage retail jobs and constant paralyzing fear. But the absolute truth is that I did not ruin their lives at all. I did not force Preston to embezzle millions of corporate dollars from the warehouse safety budgets. I did not force him to buy a $50,000 diamond necklace for a 24-year-old mistress while his loyal wife worked double shifts at the hospital. I did not force Richard and Camilla Cole to sit in a fancy French restaurant and hand me a $10,000 cash bribe to hide my existence. Their profound, blinding arrogance ruined their lives. Their deeply ingrained racism and their toxic, unearned entitlement destroyed their entire world. All I did was quietly observe their monstrous behavior. All I did was hand them the heavy steel shovel they eagerly used to dig their own permanent graves. When you build a multi-billion-dollar empire from the absolute dirt up, you learn a very valuable lesson about human nature. You learn that money is simply a magnifying glass. It does not magically change a person's core character. It merely exposes the absolute truth of who they have always been. Preston Cole was always a coward and a thief. The corporate title and the tailored suits just gave him the leverage to show his true face to the world. Richard and Camilla were always greedy, shallow parasites. The exclusive country club memberships just gave them a public platform to display their absolute lack of empathy. They genuinely thought they were the smartest people in the room because they measured a man's worth by the brand of his shoes and the zip code of his house. They were completely blinded by their own superficial metrics. They forgot that true power is never loud. True power never needs to boast or demand respect. True power is the quiet, steady foundation that holds up the entire building, while the flashy ornaments at the top take all the credit. I let them believe they were untouchable right up until the exact second I pulled the floor out from under them. The familiar loud rumble of a heavy engine interrupted my thoughts. I looked down the street and a genuine smile spread across my face. Turning the corner and pulling into my cracked concrete driveway was my old beat-up Ford pickup truck. The engine purred perfectly. The driver's side door popped open and my daughter Maya stepped out into the bright morning sunlight. She was not wearing the expensive designer dresses Preston used to force her to wear to his shallow corporate events. She was wearing comfortable denim jeans, a simple cotton work shirt, and heavy steel-toed warehouse boots. She looked absolutely radiant. She walked up the front walkway holding a thick stack of printed financial reports in her hands. She was laughing a bright, genuine laugh that warmed my entire soul. The heavy, dark shadows that had haunted her eyes a year ago were completely gone. She walked up the porch steps and handed me the reports. The business was absolutely thriving under her direct leadership. The supply chain was stronger than ever, and the warehouse employees respected her deeply because she worked right alongside them on the loading docks. The toxic infection was permanently eradicated from our lives. My family was completely safe, and my legacy was finally secure in the hands of a woman made of unbreakable steel. She sat on the porch step next to my chair, and we looked over the numbers together, sharing a quiet moment of absolute victory. I set my coffee mug down on the small wooden table next to my rocking chair. I looked directly ahead, feeling a profound, absolute peace settle over my entire life. I learned many things on my long journey from the dirty warehouse floor to the billionaire boardroom, but there is one absolute truth I will carry with me until my final breath. I want you to listen to me very carefully. Never mistake silence for ignorance. Never mistake humility for weakness. And never ever assume you are the smartest person in the room because the man quietly sweeping the floors might just be the exact same man signing your paychecks. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let us meet in the comments below. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories exactly like this one. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I am looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There is so much more on my channel. Do not forget to subscribe and hit the like button. See you in the next life story with love and respect. If there is one final lesson you take away from my story, let it be this. True wealth is never defined by the balance in your bank account, the car in your driveway, or the designer label on your back. Real wealth is the quiet integrity of your character and the unbreakable strength of your spirit. Greed is a blinding poison that makes arrogant fools believe they are invincible right up until the exact moment their fragile glass houses shatter. Protect your peace, set absolute boundaries, and never let anyone make you feel small just to inflate their own ego. You are the sole architect of your own worth, and no amount of stolen money can ever buy the genuine dignity you earn through honest hard work. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic people who only valued you for what they could take from you? Share your own experiences in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more true stories.